Chapter 225. The rain continued to pour, and occasionally, lightning flashed across the dark sky. Thunder rumbled above the clouds. Atsu was already drenched, its black fur stuck to its body, and its broken body was covered with wounds and blood. It was not far from the mountain peak, but the ferocious demon beasts behind it were getting more and more irritable. There were constantly demon beasts driven by their natural greed pouncing on it, wanting to drink its blood and eat its flesh. Atsu's response was to bite them to death. Its sharp fangs were as sharp as blades, and it was as cruel as a demon. It was a beast that was more ferocious than these beasts, and whoever dared to stand in its way would fight to the death. It was a battle of life and death, and in this stormy day, there seemed to be no end to it. The rain drenched the black dog's body, and it felt a little cold, and a little lonely. At that moment, it suddenly missed Lu Chen, and remembered the many nights when it slept quietly on the same bed with him. Perhaps, that was the most peaceful and happy moment of its life? Roar! A deep and mournful roar burst out from Atsu's throat. He bit down on the throat of a demon beast that lunged at him in the wind and rain. He tore its flesh, swallowed its blood, and then threw the dead body to the side. The auras in the distance seemed to stop for a moment, and Atsu looked back in disdain, and then continued to walk towards the peak, panting. This day was so long. Even it did not know if it could make it through. Would he be able to see the rising of the bright moon in that cloudy and rainy weather? In the dense forest, someone said this. Let's wait until the sky turns dark. That's when we have important things to do, and at the same time, let's see if anyone will come. The people around had no objections, so they walked to a secluded corner, sat down quietly, and waited. Waiting for nightfall. Dongfeng Tao and Melaleuca Japonica were waiting for the end of the ceremony, waiting for the important small meeting that would take place in the evening. Su Qingjun was also waiting for the end of this grand ceremony so that she could go back to visit her younger brother Sumo as soon as possible. Perhaps, if she could make it in time, Sister Exine would be able to find that man to come see her. In the guest room of the flowing fragrance garden, Exine was sprawled on the table in boredom, staring at the continuous rain outside the window in a daze, as if she had lost her mind. At the same time, White Lotus had already descended from the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky. She walked towards the front of Kunlun Mountain with a relaxed expression. Behind her, the strange mountain that was floating in mid-air was also covered with a layer of gray. The sky had unknowingly darkened. Rain poured down from the sky, enveloping the entire vast Kunlun mountain range, as if the entire world had become hazy. However, on the winter peak, there was not even a drop of rain. It was unknown whether it was because there was a powerful prohibition that isolated the rain outside, or because the rain fell in, but the overly cold wind and snow on the winter peak had condensed the rain into ice and snow. On the lonely and quiet winter peak, other than the violent wind and snow on the highest peak, Zhuoxian seemed to be the only person left on the entire mountain. He stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing down. For many years, he had stood at this place, gazing at the majestic Kunlun mountain, and was especially familiar with the undulating mountains of Kunlun. He could even tell where the majestic Tiankuan peak was at a glance, and he could also imagine how lively and bustling it was at this moment. For many years at this time, he would be in the Zhangyang Hall on Tiankuan Peak, rejoicing for the sect, cheering for his senior brother, and being proud of his sect. However, he had never thought about himself in the slightest. Zhuoxian lowered his eyes slightly, and after a moment, he turned around and walked towards his cave abode. The wind and snow outside were isolated, and he took out the wind speech plate, placed it on the table, and opened it. The sound of wind and snow was immediately heard, and after a moment, Hakushin Jinkuan's voice came from this strange magic treasure. What's the matter? Zhuoxian showed a respectful expression, bowed, and said, Master, you're going to watch over eldest senior brother's place tonight. May I know when you're going to leave? Hakushin Jinkuan's voice said, What time is it now? It's already afternoon, and it'll be dusk in 2 hours, so I wanted to come and ask if you have any arrangements. Hakushin Jinkuan paused for a moment, and then said, There's no other arrangements, just do as we originally agreed. I'll come down in 2 hours. Zhuoxian cupped his fists and bowed and said respectfully, Yes, I'll wait here for Master. On the wind speech plate, the wind and snow disappeared, and gradually, it returned to its original unremarkable appearance. Zhuoxian straightened his body, and his face was slightly pale, as if he was in a daze, thinking about something. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew from behind, and there was a slight chill on the back of his neck. Zhuoxian's body tensed up, and he suddenly turned around and shouted, "Who's there?" At the entrance of his cave abode, the stone door had silently opened, and after a moment, an unusually tall and burly figure appeared at the entrance of his cave abode. The dark shadow then surged into his cave abode, and completely covered him. Zhuoxian took a step back, and his expression suddenly showed some nervousness, but then he took a deep breath, and his body slowly relaxed. "You've come?" he asked in a low voice, and for some reason, there seemed to be a little bitterness in his tone.
"Yes."
The huge figure responded, and after a while, the person suddenly asked again, "Do you regret it?" The expression on Zhuoxian's face changed, and he did not answer immediately. The huge figure also seemed to be unusually patient, and did not impatiently interrogate him, but quietly waited outside the cave abode. After a while, Zhuoxian said, "There's nothing to regret." The tall figure outside the cave abode responded, and then suddenly, a white light flashed, and something was thrown in from outside the cave. Zhuoxian stretched out his hand to grab it, and when he looked at it, he found that it was a jade bottle in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, and still opened the bottle cap to take a look. He saw that there were no pills in the jade bottle, and it was filled with black water. But for some reason, the black water did not have a fishy smell, but faintly carried a strange fragrance, like the fragrance of ambergris. Zhuoxian's hand suddenly trembled, and his pair of eyes stared fixedly at the jade bottle. Both of his hands clenched tightly, as if he was 10,000 times afraid that he would accidentally drop the jade bottle. "I think you know what to do, right?" Zhuoxian slightly lowered his head, and after a while he softly said, "Yes, I know." In the depths of the damp mountain forest, the 4 Yuanying spiritual masters and the only one, Jean Dan Friar, had been waiting. However, the so-called traitor did not appear, and there was no trace of anyone approaching in the surroundings. No one spoke, and in the heavy rain, everyone waited until the sky was about to turn dark. Somewhere in the distance, there seemed to be a lively scene of gongs and drums, and celestial music floating in the air. It was not too clear, but on this day, the Yuanying spiritual masters had seen the liveliness of Tiankuan Peak. Qian Deng and Ming Zhu looked into the distance with ridicule on their faces. He, on the other hand, was sitting on the ground in a daze. Occasionally, he would glance at Taoist Du Kong's corpse, which was still lying on the ground. Then, he would immediately look away with a trace of guilt and a trace of pain in his eyes. "Aren't we going to participate in the sect council tonight?" At this time, the one who suddenly spoke was Masato Kahara, his brows slightly wrinkled. "Waiting here for half a day without anyone coming, there's no need to continue waiting." He wanted to say something, but stopped on second thought. Except for him, everyone present was a powerful and profound Yuanying spiritual master, so there was indeed no room for him to speak. Qian Deng next to him looked over saying, "In any case, there is indeed a devil sect's secret pattern that was first engraved here. Let's not do anything else. Just treat it as a matter of convenience. Let's wait for the sky to turn dark. If there really is a devil sect traitor coming, we will capture him. If the current situation has already alerted the enemy and he doesn't dare to come, then there's no harm, we just need to carry on with our business as agreed." Masato Kahara nodded slowly, saying, "Okay, I understand." The cloud board clattered, the bell and drums sounded in unison. In Tiankuan Peak's Zhangyang Hall, the tedious but solemn and lively ceremony was finally nearing completion. Many people had a trace of exhaustion on their faces, but Perfected Idol Month, who was standing on the high platform, was calm and did not seem to be tired at all. When the people at the side saw this, they naturally felt that Perfected Idol Month was indeed an amazing Yuanying spiritual master. He actually did not look tired at all after hosting the meeting for such a long time. But what should come will come. These ceremonies were completed one by one, and at the last moment, Perfected Idol Month took a break from the busy work and took a look outside of Zhangyang Hall. The sky outside was still drizzling, the lightning in the sky continued to pass through the clouds, and the thunder was like the roar of the heavens, causing large amounts of rain to pour down. The sky seemed to be darkening bit by bit. This day seemed to be over. But it also seemed like it was about to start. In the depths of the dense forest, the few Yuanying spiritual masters who had been resting with their eyes closed were abnormally calm and serene, giving people the impression that something earth-shattering was about to happen. Only when the sky slowly darkened and the night was about to envelop, Perfected Thousand Lanterns suddenly opened his eyes, looked up, and slowly stood up, saying, "It's about time, let's go."
"Where to?"
Someone asked. Tian Kuan Peak. Zhangyang Hall. Perfected Thousand Lantern faintly said, his eyes staring into the distance, his face expressionless as he walked away. The other three perfected Yuanying spiritual masters and he also followed behind him. Following their departure, the forest quickly quieted down. On that dark land, next to Dukan Junren's corpse, a hollow branch slowly moved, as if it wanted to rise, but after a moment, it suddenly sank back down and stayed in the same place, motionless. The sky darkened, and darkness descended on Kunlun Mountain. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled in the sky, like a noisy banquet was slowly opening its curtains at this time. Chapter 226. At dusk, the grand and lively meeting finally ended. Everyone worshipped their ancestors and prayed that everything would go smoothly in the coming year. They thanked the ancestors of the Kunlun party for their blessings, allowing the Kunlun lineage to survive for thousands of years without being cut off. It was still thriving today. However, the weather that day seemed to be particularly bad. The rain outside was getting heavier, and the rumbling of thunder was incessant. Although it was only dusk, the sky was already as dark as night. Countless candles had already been lit in the huge Zhangyang Hall. Otherwise, there would only be darkness left. Fortunately, the people gathered here today were all accomplished cultivators. One after another, they began to leave in an orderly manner. Only now did Immortal Idol Month let out a sigh of relief. Although it was very glorious to be the sect leader, it was indeed not an easy task to preside over the meeting for a day. He looked around with a calm expression. After a while, it would be the highlight of the day. Almost all the elites of the Kunlun sect would gather here. Although there were a few troublemakers who were not well behaved and said strange things all day long, as long as his master arrived and took charge of the meeting, everyone would naturally be obedient and there would be no more objections. This was the power of a soul formation perfected cultivator. Immortal Idol Month smiled slightly. He turned around and walked down the high platform, walking towards the back of Zhangyang Hall. In the crowd, Su Qingjun said goodbye to Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica and followed the crowd out of the hall. As for Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica, they also had to part ways here. Only Immortal Yuanying could participate in the small gathering at night. Of course, the location of the gathering would not be in such a spacious Zhangyang Hall, but in a side hall at the back of the hall. Many Kunlun disciples were leaving from the main entrance in an orderly manner. The queue was very long. Su Qingjun stood at the back of the queue and waited. Occasionally, she would look back and see Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica chatting for a while. It seemed that Melaleuca Japonica gave him a few words. After Dongfang Tao nodded in agreement, he also walked towards the door that Immortal Idol Month had left through. With him were a few other Yuanying perfected cultivators who had already arrived. Their destination was naturally the same. When they saw each other, they also smiled and nodded, including Dongfang Tao. Perhaps because he had arrived in the daytime, the expressions of those Yuanying perfected cultivators were very gentle and friendly when they saw him. They probably thought that he was also on their side. After a while, Su Qingjun walked out of Zhangyang Hall. She had just stepped out of the tall main entrance of the hall when she stepped out of the hall. The sky had actually turned completely dark. Even the drizzle that was falling from the sky could not be seen clearly from a place that was slightly further away. The cold wind blew, and the cold rain fell on her face. There was a trace of coldness that seeped into her skin. And in a place further away, the wind and rain were hurried. The night was bleak and hazy. Even the figures of those towering mountains could not be seen. Boom! Just at this moment, above the dark clouds in the sky, a sudden clap of thunder sounded. A bolt of lightning pierced through the darkness of the vault of heaven. It was like a twisted silver snake that divided the entire sky into two halves. With the help of the lightning, Su Qingjun saw the sky full of wind and rain sweeping over. The human figures were walking briskly in the dim light of the night. Most of the people were trying to leave this place, but with the help of that bright light, it reflected a group of people who suddenly walked in the opposite direction. There were a total of 4 people. The Kunlun disciples who were near them were almost all startled. They bowed continuously. The person in the lead was the head of Bai Chao Tang, Immortal Chen Deng. Following behind him were Ming Zhu, Guang Yang, and Mu Yuan, the 3 Immortal Chen Deng. With 4 people gathered together, naturally, the momentum was extraordinary. Along the way, no one dared to block their way, and they smoothly walked over. Su Qingjun was a little surprised, but she still hurried forward to greet her master, Masato Kahara. At the same time, she also greeted the other three immortal Qian Deng. Masato Kahara's expression was indifferent. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he said, "Have you also stayed here for the whole day?" Su Qingjun said, "Yes, disciple has been here all along." Masato Kahara nodded and said, "Now there's nothing else. You can go back and rest first." Su Qingjun replied with an "oh," and took a step back. Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she suddenly saw immortal Ming Zhu, who was originally walking in front of Masato Kahara, suddenly turn around. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he called out, "Wait!" Su Qingjun and Masato Kahara looked at immortal Ming Zhu at the same time. Masato Kahara frowned and said, "Senior brother Ming Zhu, what do you mean?" Immortal Ming Zhu said, "Senior brother Mu Yuan, after we go in, we also lack someone to order around. If there's anything that needs to be reported, it'll be troublesome without someone to pass the message. I was wondering if I could trouble your disciple to wait here for a while?" As he spoke, there was a smile on his face. He looked amiable, but Masato Kahara's pupils shrank slightly. After a moment, he said in a deep voice, "It's enough for me to be here. There's no need for Qingjun to come here. There's no need." Immortal Ming Zhu smiled and said, "Just in case." As he said this, he looked up at Masato Kahara and said with a smile, "What's wrong? Senior brother Mu Yuan doesn't seem to be willing?" Masato Kahara gritted his teeth. When he was about to say something, he suddenly saw immortal Ming Zhu, who was originally walking in front, suddenly look back with a cold expression. Masato Kahara was shocked and swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth. The atmosphere outside the hall suddenly became a little stiff. Su Qingjun was a little puzzled, but she could still feel the subtle atmosphere. She hurriedly said to Masato Kahara, "Master, it doesn't matter if I stay here a little longer." Masato Kahara's eyes turned cold, while immortal Ming Zhu laughed and said, "You're really a good disciple who respects her master. Not bad indeed." Immortal Ming Zhu's expression also eased a little. Then he walked forward in silence and went directly into the Zhangyang Hall. The others also followed him in. Masato Kahara's expression changed. He slowly walked to Su Qingjun's side. After a moment of silence, he said to her, "Since you've promised the two immortals, stand guard outside the door. Remember, don't worry about anything else. Just stand there." Su Qingjun was a little surprised and said, "I know. But master, what happened? Why do I feel that you look a little strange?" Masato Kahara smiled bitterly and said to himself in a low voice, "They are still a little worried about me." "What did you say?" Su Qingjun didn't hear clearly and asked. Masato Kahara shook her head and said, "Nothing. But since you've promised Master Ming Zhu, then stand here for a while. But remember two things. First, no matter what happens, don't enter the hall, especially the rear hall. That's where the Yuanying immortals gather. Do you understand?" Su Qingjun nodded and said, "Of course, we're not allowed to go to that important place." Spiritual Master Muyuan smiled, then lowered his voice and said, "Also, you should wait here for an hour at most. After an hour, when it's almost dark, you can leave by yourself. You don't have to stay too long." Su Qingjun was a little surprised. She looked up at Masato Kahara and saw Masato Kahara smiling and saying, "Don't worry, I'll tell them later. It's not a big deal." Su Qingjun was actually still worried about her brother Sumo, who was still in the guest room of Liuxiang Garden. She didn't insist and said, "All right, disciple will obey." At this time, a call came from the front. Masato Kahara glanced at the hall in front of him and said, "Then I'll go. Be careful." Su Qingjun watched Masato Kahara walk into Zhangyang Hall. He walked further and further away until he walked into the darkness behind the candlelight, until his figure could no longer be seen. At this moment, the dense forest was already pitch black. Other than the torrential downpour, it was like a cold and deathly silent world. The body of Dukan Junren, who had died not long ago, had been taken away by Qian Deng and the others. So at this moment, the open space in the forest was empty. There was only dirty water, dirty black mud, and soil mixed with mud and rotten leaves. This forest was unusually quiet and dark. Only the occasional flash of light from the lightning and thunder in the sky, could illuminate the scene under the trees for a moment. The cold rain seeped through the soil, making the dark soil feel like an ice cave. The branch hidden under the withered leaves shook a few times in the rain, like a dormant worm about to wake up. Lu Chen, of course, hadn't lost his sober mind. The scene that happened not long ago, that soul-stirring scene, seemed to be unfolding in front of his eyes. Especially when he stabbed Dukan Zhenren's lower abdomen. Lu Chen, who was hiding under the ground, received a great shock at that moment. That scene was so familiar. That knife seemed to have awakened the memory that had been sealed for many years. In that instant, he returned to that terrible night many years ago. Even with his calm and perseverance, his breathing was slightly disordered at that moment. Then, when Dukan Zhenren fell on the muddy ground before his death, Dukan Zhenren discovered that he was lurking here. Lu Chen didn't know what Dukan Zhenren was feeling at the last moment of his death. He also didn't know why Dukan Zhenren didn't shout out his whereabouts. Perhaps he just deeply hated those who killed him, or perhaps he wanted to frame them. Perhaps he was the spy of the devil cult, who had discovered his companions but refused to sell them out. Or perhaps he was simply at death's door and had no strength to shout out. This sudden massacre, the disaster that arose from the wall, made one's heart turn cold. But in the end, Lu Chen discovered that he was still unable to see clearly who was the evil cult spy who had concealed himself the most. And more importantly, he discovered that the person who had promised him to appear, until now, had still not appeared. Perhaps he should leave now? He pondered silently in the darkness, but at this moment, suddenly, amidst the sound of wind and rain, in this frighteningly cold and dark forest, from one of the gloomy paths in the forest, came a new sound of footsteps. That foot stepped on a small puddle, splashing a bit of water. Then, silently and noiselessly, it continued to approach Lu Chen in the darkness, walking over. The wind and rain became more and more urgent. Chapter 227. The sky darkened. The rumbling of thunder resounded throughout the world, and the frenzied lightning tore through the sky, as if an angry god was roaring in the sky, illuminating the dark Kunlun mountain. Light and shadow intertwined. The light was only for a moment, but the dark shadows seemed to be everywhere, and would continue like this forever. The entire gigantic Kunlun mountain flickered in the storm, lightning, and thunder, except for one place. That was between the clouds in the sky. The four strange peaks floating in the sky were majestic and motionless, and in the mysterious forbidden area below them, the thick fog that never dissipated all year round was not affected by the storm at all. All the raindrops fell silently into the thick fog, and there was no longer any movement. The thick fog did not show any signs of shrinking or retreating. Sometimes, this strange thick fog even slowly expanded outwards, slowly drifting towards the four strange peaks in the sky. This was the most deserted and empty day of the year in the most important sacred place of the Kunlun party. Because unless they were in closed-door training or could not come out for other reasons, most of the Yuanying Zhenren who cultivated between the clouds and the sky would go to Zhangyang Hall of Tiankuan Peak. As for the remaining two deity transformation stage Zhenren Tianlan, he rarely came back, and Hakushin Jinkuan had also left Winter Peak on this day a few years ago to support Zhenren Idle Month. The wind and rain were mournful, and the fog was misty. It seemed that no one was paying attention to this place anymore. Only the thick fog kept drifting in the air, looking at the dark night sky. Among the four mystical peaks of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the Winter Peak had always been a very peculiar peak. On this torrential night, the other three peaks were drenched by the rain, but the Winter Peak was the only one that didn't have any rain. Because it was too cold on this peak, almost all the raindrops would immediately turn into frost when they fell, and then turn into wind and snow that slowly drifted down. In the world of wind and snow, it was cold and lonely. Transparent icicles of different shapes could be seen everywhere, reflecting each other with a beautiful and psychedelic luster, as if it was a fairyland that was completely different from the outside world. This place was so beautiful, but there was no one around. It seemed like a place where no one should live. Hakushin Jinkuan's Immortal's Cave was located at the peak of Winter Peak, surrounded by a violent snowstorm. Legend has it that once a deity transformation stage true monarch, a supreme great cultivator, all of them would possess peerless divine abilities that could penetrate the heavens and the earth, countless marvelous Taoist techniques, and innumerable magical treasures and spirit materials. Furthermore, they would meticulously set up a magical Immortal's Cave that belonged only to them. Inside, there were all kinds of mystical things, countless formations, the gathering of countless essence from the world, and all kinds of unimaginably fierce restrictive mechanisms. There was even a saying in the cultivation world: never challenge a living soul formation perfected monarch in a perfected monarch's cave abode. Even if you were a soul formation perfected monarch. Only dead perfected monarchs of divine transformation realm would have their cave abodes loosened after a long time, allowing outsiders to spy on them. In the long history of the divine central continent, every ancient perfected monarch's cave abode was an inconceivably huge treasure trove. Just a word or two about it was enough to drive the world crazy. Even so, the ancient perfected monarch's cave abodes that had been passed down from ancient times were still extremely dangerous places. Over the years, they had claimed the lives of countless explorers who yearned for treasure. Xiaofan stood quietly outside the cave abode on Winter Peak. The wind and snow drifted past and landed on his shoulders, but he seemed to be unaware of it. High above his head was the perfected monarch's cave abode that was wrapped in a violent snowstorm. Occasionally, he would raise his head in the cold wind and glance at the mysterious abode high above. But even with his current Jin Dan realm eyesight, he was unable to see through the snowstorm, so he couldn't see the appearance of the abode clearly. He had never been to the top of the Winter Peak, and he had never seen the cave mansion before. He had always had a wish in his heart. He wanted to take a look at his master's cave abode, to see for himself whether the cave abode of the most powerful cultivator in the world was really as magical and powerful as the legend said. But, after so many years, he still didn't have this opportunity. But it didn't matter. Xiaofan had always been a very patient person. He could wait, and he was willing to wait. Just like now. He was waiting for his master Hakushin Jinkuin to come down from the abode high above. Even if the cold wind hit his face and the ice and snow froze him, he didn't care in the slightest. On the snowy ground beside him, there was a large wooden chest. Sometimes he would glance at it, and then he would look away. The night was deep, and the wind and snow drifted. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the vault of heaven. In an instant, the sky was filled with wind and snow, swirling up into the air. They gathered at one point and then suddenly dispersed, like a celestial maiden scattering flowers. In the wind and snow, a figure floated down. His appearance was haggard, and his eyes were full of spirit. It was Hakushin Jinkuin. Xiaofan deeply lowered his head. With a respectful expression, he bowed and said, "Shizuan." Hakushin Jinkuin stood with his hands clasped behind his back. With an indifferent expression, he said, "Change your clothes." Xiaofan responded. He turned around and opened the chest beside him. A gust of cold wind blew past, revealing a set of solemn and dignified formal attire in the chest. For many years, wearing formal attire had always been the privilege of the sect leader during the sect council. And as the master of Immortal Idol Month, as long as Hakushin Jinkuin sat there solemnly in this set of attire, there was no need for any words to explain everything. Just as Xiaofan bent over and was about to pick up the formal attire for his master to wear, he suddenly heard Hakushin Jinkuin's question coming from behind him. "Are you the only one on this mountain?" Xiaofyan's body suddenly stiffened. His fingers that had just touched the soft formal attire only felt an endless chill suddenly rushing into his body from his fingers, freezing the blood in his entire body. He even subconsciously held his breath. It was pitch black outside the window. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, and heavy rain poured down, making people a little flustered. Sitting in front of the window, Eclipse felt a little uneasy. At this time, a light sound suddenly came from the bed behind her, startling her and causing her to quickly look back. She saw that Sumo, who was lying on the bed, was still unconscious. She just turned over and muttered something, but her expression was actually a little frightened, as if she was dreaming of something terrible. Eclipse relaxed, but she immediately felt a little funny. Although she was also born in an aristocratic family in Kunwu City, she wasn't familiar with the other members of the Su family except for Su Qingjun, whom she had become close to these days. As for Sumo, she was usually a tyrant in Kunwu City, so she always kept a respectful distance from her. Speaking of today, it was the first time she was alone in a room with this person. She didn't know why, but she always felt a little strange. Therefore, when she saw Sumo turning over in her sleep in fright, Eclipse didn't go forward to comfort her. At this time, a thought suddenly flashed through her mind. If the person lying on that bed right now was Brother Lu, what would she do? Would she go over and take care of him? Maybe she would. She giggled and suddenly felt her face become a little hot, so she became a little shy and complained in a low voice. It was unknown whether she was talking about herself or cursing Lu Chen. But after standing like this for a while, she still opened the door and walked out. Just like that, she stood in the corridor outside the room. A gust of cold wind mixed with raindrops blew over, blowing against her face. She took a deep breath and suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. Originally, on such a dark day, a girl alone in a room with a strange man didn't look right, so it was better to just stand outside the door. Xian smiled as she looked at the rainy night. The surrounding houses were still deserted, and the people who went to Heavenly Kuan Peak still hadn't returned. On the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky, Xiaofan slightly bent his body. His fingers touched the dress. In this cold and snowy night, for some reason, a drop of sweat suddenly dripped down his forehead. It was also at this time that the old man standing behind him in the wind and snow said very indifferently, "Where's that girl White Lotus? Where did she go?" Xiaofan closed his eyes and opened them again. In that instant, he took a deep breath and everything returned to normal in the blink of an eye. The smile returned to his face. He reached out and picked up the dress from the big box, spread it out in his hands, and respectfully carried it towards Hakushin Jinkuan. At the same time, he said with a smile, "Little junior sister went down the mountain earlier." Hakushin Jinkuan snorted and said, "What's she doing down the mountain instead of cultivating on the mountain? Naughty and mischievous." Xiaofan walked to Hakushin Jinkuan's side, lifted the two sleeves of the dress with both hands, and helped Hakushin Jinkuan put it on slowly. At the same time, he said with a smile, "Although little junior sister's talent is outstanding and rare, she is still a child after all. Sometimes, it's not a big deal to play around a little." After Hakushin Jinkuan put on the dress, he let Xiaofan button up those gorgeous but also very complicated buttons in front of him. At the same time, he frowned and said to him, "You and Idle Month are both her senior brothers. When I'm not around, you should also strictly control White Lotus and not let her loose." Xiaofan nodded and said, "Yes, I understand." As they spoke, the dress was put on. Hakushin Jinkuan shook his sleeve slightly, and the two snowflakes beside him turned into a whirlpool. Then, they quietly dispersed and slowly floated down. "Let's go. We'll help your senior brother to hold the fort one last time," Hakushin Jinkuan said lightly, and then his gaze drifted to the distance. In the distance, there was a misty wind and snow, and wisps of mist were floating in the air. "It's very foggy tonight." He sighed and walked forward. However, he had only taken a few steps when his body suddenly stopped. There was silence on Winter Peak. It seemed that even the snowflakes were falling silently, and the whole world was desolate and cold. He slowly turned around and looked in the direction he was just now. The thick mist lingered in the wind and snow, but it did not dissipate. Unknowingly, the mist at the bottom of the four strange peaks had spread to the top of Winter Peak. At the same time, at the edge of the wind and snow and the mist, there was a sudden ripple in the mist. An unusually tall and burly figure appeared indistinctly in the mist. Chapter 228. The wind and snow whistled over, but when they reached the edge of the thick fog, they suddenly disappeared. The tall figure in the fog began to walk forward, out of the thick fog, and into the wind and snow. The wide sleeves of the robe, the tall stature, and the eye-catching and famous bald head clearly indicated who this person who had suddenly stepped into the Kunlun Holy Land between the sky and the clouds was. When Hakushin Jinkuan first saw the tall and burly figure, his body trembled slightly. Then, his pupils shrank as he watched the man walk out of the fog. The wind and snow drifted down, but they couldn't get close to his body. Even the night seemed to be a little further away from him. Then, he heard the bald man greet him with a smile. "Hello, senior brother." There was only one person in this world who was qualified to call Hakushin Jinkuan senior brother. That person was also a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator named Tianlan. The initial surprise on Hakushin Jinkuan's face slowly faded, and his expression gradually calmed down. At this time, he even smiled slightly and nodded. "What a rare guest, junior brother." With his hands behind his back, Tianlan casually walked forward. The falling snow silently melted and disappeared a few feet away from him, and there was not the slightest trace of footprints in the snow under his feet. If he hadn't seen this divine transformation stage perfected cultivator in front of him, he might really have thought that he didn't seem to be on Winter Peak. At this moment, this uninvited guest was looking around with some emotion. He looked at the strange snowy peak and said, Isn't that so? I've never been to Winter Peak before. Actually, let me tell you, senior brother. Back when Master was still here, I wanted to come to Winter Peak to play. In the end, it dragged on until now. I actually haven't come here for so many years. A gloomy look flashed across Bai Chen's face. It was as if Tian Lan's words had pierced some unpleasant memory in his heart. He frowned slightly. But very quickly, his gaze moved past Tian Lan and landed on the back of the tall figure. On the other side was the mist that Tian Lan had just walked out of. It was thick and deep, and at the same time, it could be clearly seen that the thick mist was still slowly rolling and drifting, slowly dispersing on this winter peak. Tian Lan turned his head and looked at Hakushin Jinkuan, saying, "Why, senior brother, don't you welcome me?" Bai Chen indifferently said, "Aren't you here whether I welcome you or not? What does it matter?" Tian Lan laughed and clapped his hands. "You're right." Bai Chen pondered for a moment before she turned her gaze slightly and looked to the other side. On this mountain peak, apart from the two strongest rulers in Kunlun Mountain, there was a third person. Zhuoxian. From the beginning, this second disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan had been standing at the side without saying a word. At this moment, when Hakushin Jinkuan looked over, Zhuoxian's face revealed a look of panic as if he wanted to say something to him. Hakushin Jinkuan wanted to say something but hesitated. Then, he shook his head slightly and sighed. Although Zhuoxian's dharma was powerful, it was clearly a little difficult for Jin Dan Friar to face a soul formation perfected lord and ask his senses to detect the other party's traces. Hence, he waved his hand slightly at Zhuoxian, signaling him to step aside. Then, he turned to face Tian Lan. His expression became serious as he looked at his powerful and terrifying junior brother. "All right, tell me, what do you want to do by coming here today?" Tian Lan smiled. His expression was gentle, and he even reached out to touch his bald head, looking a little embarrassed. He said to perfected Lord Bai Chen with a smile, "Senior brother, back then, Master told me that he wanted to give this winter peak to me, and I really like this place very much. That's why I wanted to say this today. Why don't you give this winter peak to me?" He said with a smile. Tiankuan Peak, at the back of Zhangyang Hall. Immortal Idol Month, who was still wearing a formal and solemn gown, sat in the side hall of the back hall, looking very dignified. At this moment, people were coming to the side hall one after another. Those who could come here were, of course, the highly respected Yuanying Immortal of the Kunlun Party. 2 rows of big chairs were lined up, but there were 2 main seats in the middle. Immortal Idol Month sat on one of them, and slightly behind him, there was another empty big chair, but at this moment, no one was sitting on it. Those who came would often look at the empty chair, and then return to their seats with a complicated expression, remaining silent. Dongfang Tao's seat was the last chair on the right side of the side hall. After coming in and greeting Immortal Idol Month, he sat here. At this moment, his expression also looked a little complicated. Occasionally, he would look up at Immortal Idol Month, and then quickly his eyes fell on several immortal Yuanying immortals sitting on the other side. They were led by Chen Deng, Ming Zhu, and the others. Unlike the others who were scattered, Chen Deng, Ming Zhu, Guang Yang, and the others were clearly gathered together. But the most surprising thing was the fourth person walking behind Chen Deng and the others. He was Masato Kahara, and also the leader of the Iron Branch of the Kunlun Party. In many cases, Masato Kahara's attitude was equal to the attitude of the only 4 Yuanying immortals in the Iron Branch. When he saw Mu Yuan Zhenren, who had been living a detached life away from worldly affairs, suddenly walk over and sit down in front of Thousand Lanterns Zhenren, Idol Moon Zhenren's face turned ugly for the first time. After a while, seeing that the number of people in this side hall was quite large, roughly more than 10 people, Chen Deng stood up and said to Immortal Idol Month, "Sect Master, I think there are enough people, should we start?" Immortal Idol Month snorted, but coldly said, "There are still a few people who haven't come yet, let's wait for a while." Chen Deng did not refute, only nodded, and after responding, he sat back down again. At that moment, almost all of the Yuanying immortals in this side hall had their eyes on the chair behind Immortal Idol Month. Why hasn't he come yet? Of course, Immortal Idol Month could also feel the strange expressions of the Yuanying immortals, but his expression did not change in the slightest, as if he had a well-thought-out plan. He only smiled faintly. On the contrary, Thousand Lanterns Mingyue and the others wore solemn expressions as they waited quietly. Outside the Zhangyang Hall, Su Qingjun stood quietly. At this time, many of the disciples who participated in the daytime meeting had almost all left, and even the original Taoist children in the Zhangyang Hall, probably because the night was too dark and there was too much wind and rain, so no one appeared here. Unconsciously, Su Qingjun found that in the large space in front of the Zhangyang Hall, she was the only one left. The night was mournful and cold, and the wind and rain were still falling without any signs of stopping. There was no one around, and the sky was also dark. Only a faint candlelight from the Zhangyang Hall illuminated a small area. Su Qingjun looked at the sky, and for a moment, she could not tell the time, but she felt that it was about half an hour, but there was no movement in the Zhangyang Hall. After pondering for a while, she still decided to wait a little longer. At this moment, she suddenly heard a sound of footsteps coming from the wind and rain in front of her. Su Qingjun looked up, only to see that the sky was too dark, and in the cold wind and rain, it was difficult to see clearly. She could only vaguely see the vague figure of a man, slowly walking over. Her heart suddenly felt a little nervous, and she reached behind her, holding the scabbard of the long sword. That figure gradually walked closer, all the way to the front of the hall, and then walked up the steps. Su Qingjun was suddenly startled, because she knew this person. It was He. Different from the handsome and elegant appearance of the past, at this moment, He walking in the wind and rain didn't look quite right. His face seemed to have a trace of deep exhaustion, and his clothes were somewhat messy. Of course, walking in the rain without an umbrella, it was normal to suffer a little. Under the eaves in front of the hall, the man and the woman looked at each other, each with a bit of vigilance, but after a moment, He was the first to speak, and greeted Su Qingjun. "Junior sister Su." He faintly called out to her. Su Qingjun nodded and said, "It's so late. Senior brother you still came here, is there something?" Her attitude was not stiff, but her tone was still a bit cold, as if she still remembered Sumo's injury. He asked, "Aren't you also here?" Su Qingjun said, "I want to wait for my master Masato Kahara." "Senior brother are you also waiting for that Dukan Junrin?" After saying that, she thought for a moment and said, "Oh yes, I don't think I saw him this afternoon." He smiled and said, "Yes, my master is always elusive, so I'd better wait for him here." Saying that, He looked around, and then, unexpectedly unafraid of the wet and dirty, directly sat on the stone steps not far from him. One must know, the previous storm was so strong, and the stone steps had long been wet. Su Qingjun frowned, and took 2 steps to the side, as if intentionally or unintentionally distancing herself from He. Some words, no one said it out, but they could all feel the alienation and a trace of hostility in each other's eyes. Just like that, not knowing how long, He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "This night is so windy and rainy, when exactly will the sun rise?" Su Qingjun looked at him, her expression indifferent, and replied, "It's still early." He smiled bitterly, turned his head to look at the dark night sky full of wind and rain, and was lost in thought. Even if the rain dripped on his body, he didn't care. Su Qingjun snorted, after struggling in her heart for a few times. Finally her face sank, and walked forward, directly into the wind and rain, and then left Zhangyang Hall. Chapter 229. Boom! There was an explosion of thunder in the sky. At that moment, the dark clouds in the sky seemed to be boiling. More than a dozen bolts of lightning appeared at the same time and spread wildly in all directions. The wind howled and the wind and rain howled. The entire sky seemed to be enraged and entered a state of complete madness in this dark night. The power was so great that even the winter peak, which was protected by a tight tactical formation, could feel it even though the wind and snow were not the same as the outside world all year round. The wind and snow in the sky blew faster and faster. The wind howled shrilly, wrapping around the 2 figures who were faintly confronting each other in the mountain. However, only the thick fog behind perfected Lord Tianlan still gathered and did not disperse. It seemed to be indifferent to the storm and snow. "You want my winter peak?" Hakushin Jinkuan stared at Tianlan and asked calmly. But for some reason, under his calm tone, every word seemed to have a strange power, urging the wind and snow to sweep over from every corner of the sky. They began to slowly gather above his head, like a throne of ice and snow, or a giant in the wind and snow. The cold and murderous air, like the coldness of the sky, spread quietly in the wind and snow without mercy. Tianlan also did not have any intention of avoiding his gaze. He looked at Hakushin Jinkuan, and the smile on his face disappeared. "Is it yours?" He stared at the skinny old man, his loose robe fluttering in the wind. His eyes were as sharp as a knife, as if he wanted to stab into Hakushin Jinkuin's chest and see the old man's heart. No way. Since when can things that are stolen belong to oneself? The world suddenly turned cold and no one spoke anymore. That was because they had nothing else to say. The two simple sentences from before had sealed off all their paths of retreat. This pair of brothers who had lived for a long time had finally reached this day. Finally, there was no way out for them. Wuxia subconsciously stepped back. The wind and snow were too strong, and the cold wind was too fast and too cold. When it whistled past the mountain peak, even with his cultivation, Jean Dan Fryer felt a little frightened. The two figures in the wind and snow in front of him looked so terrifying. Such a terrible storm seemed to only wrap around the two of them. It was the power of heaven and earth that they controlled. After a while, Wuxia suddenly felt a chill on his back. He had already touched a mountain wall. The hard ice adhered to the stone wall, emitting traces of coldness. He realized that at this point, he actually had no way out. His heart beat violently. He looked up at the two figures in front of him, who were starting to blur in the violent wind and snow. He suddenly gasped. The two people stood in the wind and snow, one tall and one short, one big and one small. One big and one small. One big and one small. One big and one big. One big and one big and one big. Bai Chen looked at Tianlan with a complicated expression in his eyes. However, his expression was solemn and did not show the slightest fear or timidity. The strong wind blew from behind him. That solemn and magnificent robe fluttered, as if he had lived a glorious life. He stretched out a hand. His somewhat shriveled palm was facing the sky. The sound of the wind and snow suddenly became several times louder, and even the entire winter peak seemed to faintly resonate with it. Countless white snowflakes whizzed in from all directions, desperately rushing into the faintly forming huge white shadow. The snow-wind giant, towering between the heavens and the earth, appeared on top of the skinny old man's head, and let out an earth-shaking roar towards the dark sky. The wind and clouds in the sky rolled and thunder rumbled. After a while, a huge fist descended from the sky. It made an ear-piercing whistling sound in the air and smashed towards True Lord Tianlan. Before the fist of ice and snow arrived, the ground beneath their feet had already begun to tremble. Even the fog that had been indifferent to the wind and snow all this while had actually retreated a few feet in an instant. The ferocity of the attack was evident. True Lord Tianlan's expression was solemn. He took a step back and made a circle with his hands. In an instant, his wide robe suddenly fluttered like the wind and a surge of energy burst forth. The dense fog behind him suddenly rolled. Immediately after, a mist giant with half a body appeared from the fog. It roared and pounced towards the snow-wind giant. Boom! A low and loud rumble came from the sky. The ground under his feet trembled violently. The entire winter peak that was floating in the sky also shook twice. Cracking sounds could be heard. Countless cracks instantly appeared. That was the sound of 10,000-year-old ice cracking. The two giants retreated a certain distance. They seemed to have been injured by the terrifying force just now. However, very quickly, they continued to pounce forward and collided with each other in the blink of an eye. The heaven and the earth shook, and the wind and snow roared. At that moment, on the winter peak, a naked, terrifying power was displayed. There were no tricks, no subtleties. Only for the most powerful semi-divinity realm human beings, this was the kind of pure power that returned to the natural state. All the Tao techniques and divine arts in the world that could be imagined or unimaginable or ingenious had completely disappeared at this moment. They were discarded by these two peak cultivators without any hesitation. For a moment, Wuxia, who was the only person in the world to witness this battle between divine transformation realm true lords, even had an illusion. He felt that the battle between the two giants in the sky was like a fight between two toddling babies. It was a simple and pure fight. Their movements were even a little slow. Everything seemed clumsy in the eyes of the cultivators in the world. The only thing that stood out from the rest was their terrifying power. With a punch, the heaven and earth changed color and the wind and clouds rolled. With a roar, the mountains and rivers flowed backward and the wind and snow surged. Lightning rolled down from the dark clouds and wrapped around the two terrifying giants. The electric currents darted around like strange silver snakes, but they still could not stop the two giants from fighting. Under the whistling wind and snow, Bai Chen and Tianlan were silent. Their breathing gradually became heavier, but neither of them had the slightest intention of backing down. However, as the fierce battle continued, their bodies also began to change. According to the legends, the body of a supreme was as strong as the body of a god. However, at this moment in the wind and snow, cracks began to appear on his body, just like the ice that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years and was once extremely hard. A piece of their sleeves was torn apart, and a piece of flesh exploded. Low and deep white smoke rose up and down, slowly drifting up from their bodies. Every time they shot up a white mist, their bodies would tremble, and the ground under their feet and the sky above their heads were like mountains collapsing and the wind and clouds rolling, forming a huge vortex, crazily swallowing the endless wind and snow, and then dissipating in this crazy world. Boom! After countless collisions, the beautiful snowy scenery on the winter peak was already a mess. The lightning that fell from the sky had already wrapped the entire winter peak together. It was as if doomsday had arrived. Countless silver chains descended and bound this terrifying place, about to be thrown into the burning and boiling underworld. Looking from high above the clouds, the mountain seemed to have a strange sense of beauty. Outside the clouds, the boundless thick fog had quietly surrounded the entire winter peak, completely covering this earth-shattering scene. In this fierce battle that shook the heavens and earth, the two figures that were facing each other suddenly trembled for a moment. A moment later, Hakushin Jinkuin suddenly let out an angry roar in the snowstorm. He raised his head. His face, which had always been indifferent even when he had countless hidden injuries on his body, suddenly flashed with a trace of disbelief and shock. Above his head, the incomparably powerful snow wind giant that seemed to be the ruler of heaven and earth suddenly slowed down. At the same time, the mist giant that was in front of it suddenly swung its fist. Passing through the snowstorm and lightning, accompanied by the sudden explosion of thunder in the sky, the fist landed on the snow wind giant's chest. The heavens and earth suddenly froze at that moment. The fist smashed through all the wind and frost, smashed through the unchanging power of dozens of years, smashed through the snowstorm, and pierced through the chest. The snow wind giant let out an earth-shattering roar. As if it was filled with unwillingness, it turned into fragments, filling the sky with snowflakes, and fell down from the sky. On the ground, Hakushin Jinkuin's body violently trembled. Then he spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood was black. When the black blood fell on the snowy ground, it instantly burned the surroundings. The snowy ground immediately sank, and a deep hole several feet wide appeared on the snowy ground. Hissing sounds could be heard, but strangely, there wasn't a terrifying stench in the air. Instead, there was a faint fragrance. Hakushin Jinkuin's pupils contracted for a moment. Staring at the pool of black blood on the ground, there was an uncontrollable shock in his eyes. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something, he lowered his head and looked at his own body. His skinny, old, but once powerful body was filled with scars at this moment. However, in the snowstorm, he was still solemn and dignified, like a gown that fluttered in the wind and snow. There was also a faint fragrance that was only diffusing at this moment. Hakushin Jinkuin grabbed his clothes with his 5 fingers, and with a casual tug, the entire gown instantly turned into pieces. However, at the same time, his body swayed a bit, and he spat out another mouthful of blood. Similarly, it was black. In the air, the giant formed from the mist had unknowingly dissipated, and once again became a part of the thick mist. Similarly, Tianlan, who was covered in cuts and bruises but clearly had a resolute expression, stood in the snowstorm that had once again quietened down, and quietly looked at the old man in front of him. "Good move." A low voice sounded from the snowstorm in front of them. Hakushin Jinkuin raised his head, looked at his junior brother, and said, "What poison is this, to actually be able to injure our soul transformation stage bodies?" "Black dragon saliva," True Lord Tianlan said. Then he clutched his chest, and a pained expression appeared on his face as he coughed a few times. Chapter 230. The heavy rain poured down, and the dense forest was pitch black. Water flowed down like a waterfall everywhere, and the sound of the rushing water seemed to have covered all other sounds. However, in such a pitch-black forest, there was still a figure traversing in the darkness. He walked past one tree after another that was as dark as a ghost, stepped over one damp puddle after another, and gradually approached the empty space in the middle of the forest. There was no one on the ground, only damp water mixed with black mud and dried leaves. That black figure hid behind a large tree, very cautiously looking towards the tree next to the large rock. After waiting for a long time, he found that there was still no movement. The black figure was a bit hesitant, but in the end still slowly and tentatively walked forward. The rainwater was blocked by a layer of dense branches and leaves. Landing on the black figure's body was already silent. Even when this black figure walked to the center of the clearing, nothing happened. This fact seemed to make the black figure a bit stunned and shocked. He turned his body and carefully looked around, but found that this forest was almost completely dark. Those shadows that trembled intensely in the wind and rain looked abnormally eerie and terrifying, but if one looked carefully, they would see that most of them were tree branches and leaves swaying in the wind. The air was filled with a cold aura, in this lonely and dark forest. The black figure took a step back, as if he didn't like this place, then turned around, looking like he was going to walk away. However, at this time suddenly, he only felt his feet tighten, a hand like a ghost claw suddenly reaching out from the mud under his feet, suddenly rushing out, grabbing the black figure's ankle. Ah! A short and sharp cry suddenly pierced through the silence of the dark forest. In this gloomy rainy night, something like a hand suddenly reaching out from the ground, this kind of thing, it really was too creepy. Even though the black figure had seen many evil things in the past that could challenge the limits of ordinary people, at this moment, he still couldn't help but shiver, involuntarily crying out. That short and sharp voice, it was actually a woman. This sudden sound, the hand underground also seemed to be startled. The originally murderous hand gesture also paused for a moment. In the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, the black shadow quickly calmed down. With a light shout, he stomped heavily on the ground. Immediately after, a sharp icicle appeared in his hand and pierced into the soil, intending to pierce through the person in the soil. But what welcomed her was a large handful of darkness, accompanied by a roar. A large amount of dirty black soil and a large amount of water suddenly surged up from the ground, covering the sky and covering the earth, directly rushing to the side. The black figure screamed, in an instant disregarding everything, directly retreating. But behind the black soil, a figure suddenly leaped out from the soil. It was Lu Chen. Like a cheetah, he pounced towards the black figure. He moved later, but arrived first. In an instant, he grabbed the black figure's body, and with his right hand, he locked her slender neck. That black figure's head suddenly raised, one hand grabbing onto Lu Chen's fierce arm, the lower leg instead silently kicked out. After a moment, only a pang sound was heard, directly hitting on Lu Chen's lower abdomen. Lu Chen grunted, and his face instantly paled in the darkness. However, his toughness and tenacity were completely displayed at this moment. He gritted his teeth and endured the pain of this kick. Then his arm tightened, and the black fire in the depths of his eyes suddenly blazed. It directly pressed down on the arm, and only after it pressed down hard on the neck was there heard. There was only a painful grunt, and the black figure's body immediately went limp. And at this moment, only a shocking thunder was heard in the sky, as if in the distant horizon there was a terrifying and powerful impact bursting out. At the same time, a bolt of lightning suddenly split the sky, illuminating the world. In the middle of the forest, that bolt of lightning similarly illuminated the darkness here for a moment. The heavy rain poured down. In the drizzling water, Lu Chen saw that person close at hand. That was White Lotus. White Lotus's face was extremely pale, seemed to have been injured in that short but intense fight just now. But her mind was still clear. Right now her eyes were opened, similarly saw Lu Chen, that pale-faced man covered in mud and water. Therefore, at the same time, she was also stunned. The lightning disappeared from the sky, so darkness once again returned to this part of the forest. Heavy rain poured down, the violent wind blowing the leaves and branches incessantly whistling. In the dark forest, the man and woman who were still entangled together and fighting each other were in a deadlock. In the darkness, they seemed to be able to hear each other's breathing. After a moment, Lu Chen felt a light and slightly probing force from his hand, as if it wanted to push his hand away. He was silent, but after a moment, he still slowly let go of his hand. At the same time in the darkness, White Lotus also slowly withdrew her other hand hidden in the darkness. Just a little bit more, her hand would be able to touch Lu Chen's flesh and blood. A faint light flashed in the darkness, then disappeared. A moment later, in the darkness, the two of them suddenly spoke in unison. "So it's you." Between the clouds in the sky, on the winter peak. In this cold world, there was still snow and frost falling, but in the falling snow, there was suddenly a strange moist thing that was strands of rain. Rain from the sky. This was perhaps the first time in a long time that rain had passed through the snow and landed on the winter peak. Hakushin Jinkuan, who was standing in the snow and vomiting black blood, raised his head to look at the sky above the winter peak, his eyes a little disappointed. In the sky, lightning raged and thunder rumbled, as if the heavens were showing unprecedented anger, venting its terrible power on this mountain peak. Perfected Lord Bai Chen retracted his gaze and turned his head. However, he didn't speak to his number one enemy, Perfected Lord Tianlan. Instead, he looked at Zhuoxian, who had been standing silently by the side the entire time. Zhuoxian, who was leaning against the ice wall, looked abnormally pale, as if witnessing the soul-stirring battle between perfected lords was a great burden to him. Jean Dan Friar. At the same time, the originally incomparably hard ice wall behind him had more than a dozen cracks of various sizes, and from time to time, ice shards would fall. Some of the ice shards fell directly on Zhuoxian's head, but he did not dodge and stood motionless like a piece of wood. This was because Hakushin Jinkuan's gaze was fixed on him. Why? Perfected Lord Bai Chen asked him. There was not much fury or hatred in his eyes. Instead, there seemed to be more confusion and confusion. Zhuoxian lowered his head slightly, and after a while he said, "I'm sorry, master." Hakushin Jinkuan shook his head, frowned, and vomited another mouthful of black blood. However, for some reason, after the black blood left his mouth, his originally black aura shrouding his exhausted face actually looked a little better. Then, he looked at Zhuoxian and repeated, "Why?" Zhuoxian was silent, then took a deep breath and said, "I can't accept it." "What can't you accept?" Hakushin Jinkuan stared at him, then coughed painfully and said, "You're also at this age now, what do you not have? What is there to be unwilling about?" Zhuoxian shook his head and said, "There's everything, it's you and senior brother, not me." Hakushin Jinkuan smiled bitterly. Suddenly his body trembled and he vomited another mouthful of black blood. Then he took a deep breath, his eyes brightened a little, stared at Zhuoxian and said, "I didn't expect that you didn't say a word all these years, so it's because you're dissatisfied." Zhuoxian said, "That's because you've never valued me. The successor is eldest brother, and the position of the head is eldest brother. All the mystical materials, resources, cultivation methods, and the best ones are eldest brothers. I can only follow eldest brother forever. That's why he's a Yuanying realm cultivator, and I'm just a Jindan realm cultivator." Hakushin Jinkuan shook his head, disappointment on his face, said in a low voice, "I didn't expect you to be so muddle-headed." Zhuoxian said, "You said it just now, I'm also old now. If I don't fight for it, I'll be like this for the rest of my life, but I don't want to be like this." "Haha," Hakushin Jinkuan sneered and said, "How ambitious. Come, tell me what kind of great benefits can this remarkable junior brother of mine give you? Is it enough for you to betray me and plot against me?" Zhuoxian was about to speak, but suddenly, the deep voice of perfected Lord Tianlan floated over in the wind and snow, saying indifferently, "I promised him a future of Yuanying Zhenren." Hakushin Jinkuan suddenly turned around and stared at Tianlan for a moment, then with a disdainful face, he sneered at Zhuoxian and said, "You actually believe this kind of nonsense that can fool a child? Since ancient times, have you ever heard of any method that can let someone rise from Jindan to Yuanying? That's a great life or death juncture. Who can avoid it?" He looked at Zhuoxian. There was no murderous intent on his face, only deep disappointment. He said, "I've taught you for decades, but I didn't expect that I've taught you such an idiot." Zhuoxian did not say anything, but perfected Lord Tianlan took a step forward and said, "Senior brother, you're old, there are many things in this world that you don't know, you're just a frog at the bottom of a well." Hakushin Jinkuan's haggard face suddenly frowned, and with a wah sound, he vomited a large mouthful of black blood. But strangely, after vomiting blood this time, his face actually quickly became ruddy, and he looked even more spirited than usual. Wind, frost, rain, and snow unknowingly gathered above his head again. This old divine transformation realm perfected Lord slowly straightened his body, and a majestic and powerful aura that had never been seen before slowly flowed out from his body. "Oh, a frog at the bottom of a well?" He laughed, then looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, looked at Zhuoxian, looked at the thick fog, and then looked at the deep night sky. "Even if you're a frog, I can also eat you," he said indifferently. Chapter 231. The wind and rain met the peak of the mountain, and lightning shone on the black dog. The highest point of this nameless mountain was a long and narrow slope at the top of the mountain. A large stone stood there abruptly, about 7 or 8 feet from the ground. Standing on this large stone, it was as if standing on the highest point of the mountain, overlooking the surrounding wilderness. However, in this stormy night, there was no longer any scenery around this large stone. There was only the smell of blood that even the wind and rain could not blow away. The corpses that littered the ground and the blood that flowed everywhere were telling of everything that had happened here. In this stormy night, this barbaric and tragic story that was outside the sight of humans was told. The black dog was still alive. It was still breathing. It was still standing on the highest point of the large stone. At its feet, there were badly mutilated corpses everywhere. Those demon beasts that coveted its flesh and blood had already been drained of their own blood. Their corpses covered the long and narrow slope of the mountain. In the distance, there were not many terrifying auras left. There were not many, but there were still some. On this night, the impulsive demonic beasts had all died. The demonic beasts that were not strong enough had all died. The demonic beasts that were not cunning enough had all died. The demonic beasts that were not brave enough had all run away. Behind the thick and nauseating stench of blood, under the illumination of the occasional flashes of lightning, one could still vaguely see that behind the slope, there were still 2 remaining gazes coldly staring at Big Rock's direction. They lingered around, still coveting the delicious flesh and blood. The heavy rain continued to fall, hitting the body of Atsu on the large stone. At this moment, there was not a single intact piece of flesh on its body. There were wounds and bloodstains everywhere. It looked like its own blood was about to run dry. However, Atsu still did not fall. It was like a lonely but paranoid mad dog, gritting its teeth as it stood on the large stone, coldly scanning the dark world. But at the same time, at the moment when the lightning flashed, even it and the remaining 2 cold gazes beside it felt the black dog's body tremble and saw that it was on the verge of collapse. Perhaps in the next moment, the black dog would fall from the boulder and die on the spot. So the 2 eyes hidden in the darkness were still quietly waiting for the unusually fierce black dog to end its own life. In any case, how could there be a bright moon on such a stormy night? Without the power of the full moon, no matter how powerful a holy beast was, it would be impossible for it to become a holy beast. The black dog undoubtedly knew this as well. Perhaps no one had ever told it, but when the monster blood in its body stimulated its instincts, it also understood this rule. The wind and rain were too strong, so it was impossible for the moon to appear. But at this point, there was already no way out for it. Atsu slowly crouched down. Surrounded by bloody corpses, at the highest point of the hill, he raised his head and looked at the sky. Other than the desolate wind and rain, there were only layers of thick, dark clouds. There was no sign of the moon. A soft whimper came from its mouth and it lowered its head, as if at this last moment, it finally had to admit defeat to its fate. Darkness surged, and the black dog's figure on the highest point of the hill looked so lonely. At the foot of the hill in the distance, 2 cold and gloomy voices slowly rose to their feet, as if they had finally waited for the best opportunity, and they began to walk towards the top of the hill. The atmosphere on Winter Peak suddenly became a little strange. Although the wind and snow were still dancing, and although there was still lightning flashing and thunder rumbling in the sky, the temperature on the snowy ground by the cliff was dropping rapidly. The falling snowflakes were getting heavier and heavier, and the atmosphere between heaven and earth was cold and somber. Occasionally, when one raised his head to look at the peak of the hill, he would notice that the violent snowstorm that had enveloped the top of the hill had suddenly left the peak and began to slowly move downwards, gradually approaching the 2 people who were facing off against each other. Hakushin Jinkuen stood in the snow and stared at Tianlan, saying word by word, "You actually dared to come to this Winter Peak to challenge me. This is the stupidest thing you've ever done." Perfected Lord Tianlan also raised his head to look at the slowly falling snowstorm. A moment later, he smiled and looked at Hakushin Jinkuen, his eyes slightly narrowed. "Is that so?" Hakushin Jinkuen snorted coldly. "Before Master died, he told me that you're arrogant and bold, and if you achieve great success in Taoism in the future, the disaster you'll cause would probably be far worse than the 3 Realms fiend cult. Today it seems that it's true." His gaze was like lightning as he stared coldly at Tianlan and said coldly, "How dare you go to the underground palace and steal the black dragon's saliva that was born from that fiend?" Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. "Oh, did Master say that, or did you say that yourself?" Bai Chen's expression was cold as she said, "Those of us who know the cause and effect of that case back then naturally know what happened. I only have one thing to say. I have a clear conscience." What a coincidence. Perfected Lord Tianlan took a step forward and said indifferently, "When I went to visit Master's grave yesterday, I also said those words in front of his grave. I have a clear conscience." He enunciated each word clearly, his voice rumbling like thunder. Hakushin Jinkuan didn't say anything else, but before he really made a move, he deliberately turned to look at Zhuoxian who was standing at the side. There was no expression on his face, but his eyes were colder than the snow in the sky. Although he didn't say anything, the coldness in his eyes was very clear and obvious. Zhuoxian understood his master's meaning. His face quickly turned pale. At the same time, he also discovered that as the snowstorm descended and the temperature of the snowy ground around him plummeted, the ice wall behind him, which had almost shattered into pieces, suddenly began to solidify again. The snowstorm grew stronger, and his body became colder. Perfected Lord Tianlan remained motionless because none of the snowstorm could approach his body. All he did was calmly watch the falling snowstorm. Moments later, he suddenly sensed something and looked down at his feet. It was a snowy land that was covered in a thick layer of snow. But at this moment, a faint tremor suddenly came from the depths of the ground beneath their feet. It was as though a wave was rising from the depths of this massive mountain and spreading out like a ripple. The thick layer of snow on the snowy ground suddenly trembled. Countless soft snowflakes bounced up slightly. Then, it happened a second time, a third time, each time more obvious and more intense than the last. Then, everyone felt that it was the winter peak that was trembling, the mountain peak that was roaring. Whoosh! Hakushin Jinkuan fluttered his clothes and flew into the air. At the same time, the snowstorm in the sky descended like a snow-white and violent ring, wrapping around Hakushin Jinkuan like a king of ice and snow. With Hakushin Jinkuan at the center, it formed a huge snowball that danced violently in the air. The winter peak was shaking more and more violently. Countless pieces of ice and snow flew up and surged towards the huge snowball from all directions. The wind was shrill and sharp, almost like a knife, cutting through the hard ice on the mountain walls along the way. The skinny but godlike old man was hidden in the huge snowball with unparalleled power. His voice was like the howl of the snowstorm, resounding between heaven and earth. "You shouldn't have come here," he said coldly. Then, he raised his hand and pointed. The place where he pointed and the direction in which he pointed suddenly froze. Be it the drifting snowflakes or the blowing wind, everything froze into ice. Then, there was a cracking sound like a sharp blade that pierced through the void and swiftly formed a sharp thorn in the air. Then, the snowstorm suddenly became louder and expanded from the original snowball by several times. In the air, a similar thorn appeared around the icicle thorn. Then, as if it was spreading, countless icicles appeared in an instant, covering the sky and the earth. Tens of thousands of icicles surrounded Perfected Lord Tianlan from all directions. The icicle's tip flickered with a faint, transparent light and was filled with killing intent. Zhuoxian, who was hiding at the side, suddenly revealed a look of despair. He thought that he had valued his old master enough, but it was not until today that he truly realized that the power of a divine transformation stage Perfected Lord was far beyond what he could covet. He had yet to witness his master's true power. However, perhaps because of this, Zhuoxian's eyes soon burned with the flames of anger, jealousy, and indignation. He had never known such a powerful realm and such terrifying power, but his eldest senior brother definitely knew. Even his junior sister White Lotus, who had just entered the sect not long ago, had been directly taught the secret technique of the snow scripture by their master at a young age. Given time, she would definitely know about this terrifying Taoist technique as well. He was the only one who didn't know anything. Compared to Zhuoxian, who had lost his composure, Tianlan, who was a divine transformation stage Perfected Lord of the same realm as Bai Chen, was clearly much calmer than Zhuoxian. Even though he was surrounded by tens of thousands of sharp icicles and was in danger of being pierced through the next moment, Tianlan's expression did not reveal too much worry. He even looked at Hakushin Jinkuan, who was floating in the huge snowball, from afar. After a while, he grinned and said, "Even I have to admire you for guiding the chi of the strange spirit vein and forcefully seizing the mysterious ice formation for your own use. I really have to say that you're amazing to be able to do all this." He shook his head and sighed. There seemed to be a hint of admiration on his face, but very soon, Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled faintly again. This time, there was a hint of mockery. "Are you going to fight me to the death, senior brother?" Chapter 232. Hakushin Jinkuin didn't mind Perfected Lord Tianlan's slightly sarcastic tone. Those who could cultivate to the highest realm in the world and stand at the pinnacle of the human race's martial strength had all tempered their will to be as tough as steel in the long process of cultivation. However, confidence and pride didn't equate to stupidity and blindness. The person in front of him was his junior brother and also a talented perfected lord of the divine transformation realm. Bai Qin definitely didn't think that Tianlan was someone who could be easily dealt with. Furthermore, the current situation was obviously the result of Tianlan's sudden intrusion into Winter Peak after careful planning. Putting everything else aside, just the fact that his second disciple, Wuxia, had betrayed him showed how dangerous the situation was. Bai Qin even began to worry about the situation below Winter Peak. Today was the day the sect council would be held. According to the plan, the eldest disciple, Idle Month, should be in Tiankuan Peak's Zhangyang Hall having a meeting with the various elites in the sect. During the most important night meeting, he might still be waiting for her to go over and hold the fort. However, Tianlan suddenly came and blocked him on the Winter Peak. Hakushin Jinkuin could easily imagine that there must be some conspiracy behind this. However, at this moment, he couldn't quickly contact his eldest disciple. Therefore, the best and most effective way was to quickly settle the matter in front of him. In fact, the fight at the foot of the mountain wasn't a big deal. It was nothing more than some intrigue and murder. Even if it was murder, how many people could they kill? Could they turn the world upside down? What mattered was that junior brother Tianlan in front of him was the only person who could truly threaten him. As long as he could win here, what couldn't he clean up? True Lord Bai Chen's mind spun to this point, but it only took a moment for him to clearly understand the importance of this chaotic situation. His gaze became even colder as he stared at the bald and burly man below and said coldly, "Junior brother, on account of Master's warning before his death, I can spare you this time. As long as you hand over that traitorous disciple, Wuxia, to me to deal with and retreat from Winter Peak, I'll treat it as if today's matter never happened. Otherwise..." At this point, Hakushin Jinkuin sneered and glanced at the transparent thorns that filled the sky with cold light. "Don't forget, this is Winter Peak, the cave abode that I've managed for many years. It won't be difficult for me to take your life." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the figure wrapped in the snowstorm and didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stared thoughtfully for a moment. Then, he suddenly sensed something and turned to look at Wuxia under the ice wall. Wuxia's face was as pale as a piece of paper. His chest rose and fell and his breathing seemed to become rapid. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed heartily and waved his hand at him. Then he pointed at the figure in the snowstorm and said, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. He's just scaring people." The snowstorm suddenly became urgent and the whistling sound became louder. It seemed that his words had angered Hakushin Jinkuin in the snowstorm. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem to care. He squinted slightly and looked at Hakushin Jinkuin for a moment. He smiled and said, "Senior brother, I wasn't so sure at first. But after hearing what you said, I probably know that the black dragon's saliva is not easy to bear. It's not so easy to detoxify it by spitting out 2 mouthfuls of blood, right?" Hakushin Jinkuin sneered and didn't say anything else. He controlled the snowstorm to descend slowly and the sharp spikes in the sky began to tremble slightly. It was as though the final battle had arrived and the next moment, thousands of arrows were going to shoot and poke Perfected Lord Tianlan into a sieve. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have sensed Hakushin Jinkuin's determination. He nodded and the smile on his face disappeared. Ding! It was unknown which crystal-clear icicle suddenly vibrated and let out a sound. All of a sudden, this pleasing sound with a hint of coldness rang out. Countless icicles began to move, sealing off all of Perfected Lord Tianlan's escape routes. Seeing that a huge battle was about to break out, Wuxia, who was watching from the side, subconsciously held his breath. However, at that moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly stomped his foot. That foot stepped into the snowy ground, passing through the snowflakes and landing on the solid ground. In an instant, it was as though the mountains were shaking and the earth was cracking. A huge hole suddenly appeared where Perfected Lord Tianlan was standing. Then, Perfected Lord Tianlan's burly figure fell into the hole and disappeared in an instant. In mid-air, Hakushin Jinkuin let out a furious roar. The snowstorm roared and countless transparent sharp spikes came crashing down. In the blink of an eye, the snowy ground was riddled with holes. Not only the snowy ground, Even the soil layer was pierced by these powerful ice spikes. However, perfected Lord Tianlong had actually disappeared. After a while, the winter peaks suddenly shook again. Under the snowstorm where Hakushin Jinkuan was, a large cloud of snowflakes exploded and a figure soared into the sky. With a deafening whistle, he charged into the snowstorm from below. Soon after, hundreds of sharp ice spikes rushed out from the ground and chased after perfected Lord Tianlong's body as if they were hunting for his life. They also charged into the snowstorm. Like the rumbling of thunder, all kinds of strange sounds came from the snowstorm. After a while, lightning suddenly appeared and shuttled through the snowstorm. At the same time, the wind speed became faster and faster, so much so that people could not see what was happening in the snowstorm. Suddenly, a loud roar exploded from the depths of the snowstorm. The lightning suddenly became more than 10 times brighter and rushed in all directions. Countless snowflakes and ice blocks also exploded, destroying everything in the vicinity of the snowstorm. The mountain walls collapsed and the snowdrifts collapsed. Countless white snow fell with a loud roar like an avalanche. Xiaofan had long noticed that something was wrong and hid far away. Even so, he was still forced into a sorry state by the surging and wild power. For a moment, he was shocked. Perhaps this was the true power of a divine transformation stage perfected Lord? They could seize the power of heaven and earth, break the mysteries of creation, and turn into gods with divine power that could destroy heaven and earth. Snow fell and the heavens and earth moaned. After a while, when the fierce snowstorm gradually calmed down, the snowstorm that had been wreaking havoc in the air had disappeared at some point. The two divine transformation stage perfected monarchs had already landed on the snowy ground from midair. However, the snowy ground was already riddled with holes and was uneven. There were deep pits and big holes everywhere. Only the two of them stood facing each other more than 20 feet away from each other. They did not seem to be in a good condition. Perfected Lord Tianlong's sleeves were torn in several places. His face was also a little pale and some of his wounds were bleeding. Hakushin Jinkuan's condition was worse. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth and turned black. The two of them stood facing each other. After a while, Hakushin Jinkuan suddenly said, "You're indeed more talented than me. We're 20 years apart in age, but you've actually caught up to me in terms of cultivation." Unexpectedly, perfected Lord Tianlong did not mean to be modest. He just nodded and said, "You're right." Hakushin Jinkuan sneered. He took a deep breath and wiped the black blood from the corner of his mouth. He said coldly, "Although your cultivation is high and you plotted against me with poison, I'm naturally not your match if we were outside. But you insisted on fighting on my winter peak. You can't blame me for borrowing the power of Snow Wind Spirit Mountain. So in the end, you're still the loser." Tianlong frowned and seemed to think about it seriously. Then he nodded and said, "You're also right about this." Hakushin Jinkuan's face turned cold. He did not seem to be happy or excited at all. On the contrary, his pupils contracted and a trace of fear and worry flashed across his eyes. At their level of deification, their mastery of the spiritual power of heaven and earth, Tao Dharma and divine sense had long been meticulous and exquisite, and their judgment of the situation was rarely wrong. However, even though Tianlong admitted that in the end, Hakushin Jinkuan, who borrowed the spiritual power of the cave mansion on Spirited Mountain, would be more advantageous, Tianlong himself did not have the slightest intention to retreat. He was even smiling there with calmness, as if he had nothing to fear. At that moment, Hakushin Jinkuan's mind was like electricity. He almost subconsciously wondered if there was someone else besides Xiaofan who had betrayed him and arranged some extremely sinister means for him. But very soon, he was shocked to find that his mind was a little chaotic at that moment. He had clearly gained the upper hand with the power of the cave mansion on Spirited Mountain, but why was his mind restless? What was the answer to this question? Perfected Lord Tianlong stared at him and suddenly said, "Senior brother, after Master's death, the two of us have been fighting openly and secretly for decades. Until today, I suddenly realized that you are actually old." Hakushin Jinkuan sneered and did not speak. Instead, he took a deep breath. The endless wind and snow once again gathered around him, and the powerful snowstorm seemed to show a little pattern again. No matter how glib Tianlong was, as long as he was on this winter peak, with the help of the spiritual power of heaven and earth mountains, he would never lose. Then why did he have to talk nonsense? Tianlong shook his head slightly and looked at Hakushin Jinkuan with a trace of pity in his eyes. It was a kind of condescending manner, a special look of a victor to a loser. In Hakushin Jinkuin's life, no one had ever dared to look at him like this. Except now. Hakushin Jinkuin sneered. He raised his hand and the snowstorm surged again. However, at this moment, his eyes suddenly froze and he suddenly looked up. He looked past perfected Lord Tianlan's figure and looked at the mist behind him. The thick mist had unknowingly spread to the entire winter peak. At this moment, the mist also seemed to surge rapidly. A huge shadow that was comparable to the entire winter peak slowly appeared behind perfected Lord Tianlan's composed figure. There was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky. Lightning tore the sky apart. Under the light, a terrifying black claw that was even twice the size of perfected Lord Tianlan's body reached out from the thick mist. With a boom, it grabbed the land of the mountain. The wind and snow in the world were filled with desolation. Then, the entire sky suddenly darkened. Chapter 233. The silhouette in the thick fog looked as big as a mountain. As it swayed, streams of black gas soared into the sky. Following that, the huge black claw with protruding joints suddenly grabbed onto the ground of the cliff of Winter Peak. The sharp and terrifying claws instantly pierced through the incomparably hard rocks, firmly grabbing onto it without letting go. After a moment, under the gaze of everyone on Winter Peak, that huge black claw suddenly contracted, as if it had used all its strength. Its bones and muscles bulged, and then an even bigger shadow rose from the bottom of Winter Peak. The dense fog tumbled like boiling water. It seemed to be extremely agitated, or perhaps it was filled with fear. In this dark night, a huge head could be vaguely seen, slowly approaching from the dense fog. There was a deep and thunderous breathing sound, even suppressing the sound of the snowstorm. Two huge eyes gradually appeared in the dense fog. There seemed to be a flame burning fiercely within it, and that flame was shockingly as deep as ink. Dark flames. Boundless dense fog was emitted from the ground. It had already completely surrounded the four odd peaks between the clouds and the sky, tightly wrapping around the most important forbidden area of the Kunlun party. In this pitch-black night, looking from afar, there was actually not the slightest hint of abnormality. Only at a certain moment in the midst of the violent storm, lightning and thunder, when the lightning that suddenly tore apart the night sky and landed on this dense fog, could some shadows be seen. However, for some unknown reason, there should have been an earth-shattering battle in the dense fog. But at this moment, not the slightest movement could be heard from within the fog. Not a single trace. The place beyond the clouds in the sky was still submerged by the storm. The heavy rain was still falling, and the cold wind was still blowing, covering the entire Kunlun mountain range in the darkness of the night. No one knew when this night would be over. In the side hall behind the Zhengyang Hall of Heavenly Kun Peak, almost all the enlightened Yuanying who came to this place had already arrived. In the middle of the hall, there were two main chairs and two large rosewood chairs, 10 on the left and 9 on the right, were arranged in a straight line. Today, the Kunlun party was the top cultivation sect in the divine central continent. In addition to the two perfected lords of soul formation who commanded the masses, there were 19 top Yuanying perfected masters in the sect. Among them, there were 15 in Kuinji, and 4 in Tieji, led by Masato Kahara. But recently, Dongfang Tao had just broken through and became the 20th Yuanying Zhenren of the Kunlun party, so there was an additional red sandalwood chair in this side hall. At this moment, there were already many people sitting on the chairs. After Dongfang Tao arrived, he very consciously sat in the last seat according to seniority. From his point of view, he saw perfected Idle Month sitting upright and still on the main seat in front of him, looking dignified. Slightly behind him was another large chair, which was still empty at the moment. As everyone knew, that seat belonged to Hakushin Jinkuin. 2 rows of perfected Yuanying great perfected masters were seated below him. If this lineup was casually seen by others, it would be truly frightening. This was the embodiment of the powerful strength of the current Kunlun party and the foundation of the Kunlun sect. To the left of Taoist Master Idle Moon sat Taoist Master Thousand Lanterns. Below him were Taoist Master Pearl, Taoist Master Guangyang, and the others. To the right of Taoist Master Idle Moon, the first seat was empty. Further down, Dongfang Tao could also see that several Yuanying perfected masters who were close to perfected Idle Month, including several Yuanying perfected masters who had appeared in the Zhengyang Hall during the day earlier, were also sitting there. When they sensed Dongfang Tao's gaze on them, they also smiled and nodded at him. From the looks of it, the atmosphere in the hall seemed to be rather relaxed. Dong Fangtao thought indifferently. Occasionally, when his gaze swept past the area in front of him, he would notice some strange details. Perfected Idolmont's expression was dignified and serious, but his eyes would glance at the nearest empty seat every now and then. There was a faint trace of anxiety in the depths of his eyes. Perfected Thousand Lanterns and the others on the opposite side of the empty seat remained silent. Their faces were calm and indifferent, but they would occasionally reveal a trace of a smile with a hint of coldness and mockery. It was Dong Fangtao's first time coming to this side hall. After a moment of silence, he lowered his voice and quietly asked a perfected Yuanying perfected master who was sitting next to him. After receiving the answer, he nodded and thanked him. When he raised his head again to look at the empty seat, his gaze was somewhat different. That empty seat originally belonged to Heavenly Soldier Hall's Dukan Junren. It was already so late. Why was it that Dukan Junren, the sect leader's most hardcore, most resolute, and at the same time most unlikely partner to be absent, had still not come here? Where did he go? Other than Dukan Junren, there were several other empty chairs in this hall. However, most of the reasons were known to everyone. For example, there was a perfected Yuanying perfected master from Tieji who was in closed-door training in order to extend his lifespan. If he failed, he would probably die of old age. There were also some who were in closed-door training in order to practice some kind of extremely difficult Dao technique. This kind of closed-door training could not be interrupted, so they did not come here. But basically, those who could come here and those who should have come here were almost all here. Right now, in this side hall, there were only two people who should have come but had not yet. One was Dukan Junren, and the other was even more influential. It was the owner of the chair next to Perfected Idol Month, Hakushin Jinkuan. These two were undoubtedly Perfected Idol Month's strongest supporters in the Kunlun party, especially his teacher, Hakushin Jinkuan, who was an important person. The impact of these two's absence was obvious. Even just by looking at them, it made people feel that Perfected Idol Month's side had suddenly become much emptier, giving off a strange feeling of weakness. Perfected Idol Month was indifferent to this, as if he did not feel anything. He was still sitting quietly, as if his patience at this moment was endless, ready to wait for these two people to come. Perfected Idol Month was the sect master. If he showed that he was willing to continue waiting, most people would not say anything against it. Although the identity of a Taoist master of Yuanying stage is precious, each of their time is extremely precious, but tonight is obviously a different night, and to be able to cultivate to this point, how can there be a stupid idiot? Although there is no sign tonight, the atmosphere has been a bit different from previous years. Perfected Qian Deng's faction was silent and did not move, while those from Perfected Idol Month's faction began to frown one after another, their faces revealing a hint of worry. There was also a portion of Perfected Yuanying who was usually neutral, who also felt that something was wrong. After observing the situation for a while, they all looked at their noses at their hearts, and their mouths were shut. I don't care if it's wind or rain, I'll just sit and watch. Dong Fangtao was a newcomer who had just arrived at this realm. In the past, he had actually more or less heard of some undercurrents surging in the sect and stories of open and secret strife. However, he was not a direct descendant of the lineage of ancestor Tian Hong, so his position in the Kunlun sect had always been somewhat marginalized. It was precisely because of this that Dong Fangtao showed the attitude of relying on Perfected Idol Month on this day, and received Perfected Idol Month's praise and acceptance. No matter what, because Perfected Yuanying was a powerful and precious battle force, it was necessary to win over them. However, after arriving at this side hall, Dong Fangtao suddenly realized that his choice did not seem to be as stable as Mount Tai as he had originally thought. The hostility in this sect towards Perfected Idol Month's faction was much stronger than he had expected. Dong Fangtao was a little puzzled about this, because his many years of experience had long since explained one problem. As long as Hakushin Jinkuan was around, Perfected Idol Month's position was unshakable, and Perfected Idol Month's faction's power was unshakable. But why did those people seem to be a little aggressive? Why did they dare to do this? Why did they seem not too afraid? As Dong Fangtao was pondering, a voice suddenly sounded in the hall that had been silent for a long time. It was Perfected Qian Deng, who was sitting on the left side of the main seat, slowly standing up. His gaze was calm as he looked around at the crowd. In that instant, Dong Fangtao's heart suddenly trembled, as if he had sensed something, and he actually became a little nervous. Perfected Idol Month, who was sitting on the main seat, also suddenly raised her head. Her gaze was cold, and a sharp light seemed to shoot out from her eyes as she stared at Perfected Qian Deng. However, Perfected Qian Deng didn't seem to notice this. He didn't even carefully look at Perfected Idol Month. Instead, his gaze swept across the faces of all the Yuanying spiritual masters present. After a moment, he suddenly smiled and said, "It's getting late. It's already past the time for our little meeting, right?" At that moment, the entire hall was silent. It was unknown how many nascent soul-perfected masters were sitting still, their faces expressionless. Dongfang Tao, however, took a deep breath, as if he was preparing himself to welcome the sudden storm. No one spoke, and no one responded to Perfected Qian Deng. The atmosphere in the hall was subtle and strange. However, Perfected Qian Deng didn't seem to mind at all. After looking around, he smiled and continued, "Therefore, I feel that we should begin now. Everyone here is a Yuanying spiritual master, and everyone's time is precious. Am I right, Senior Brother Sect Master?" His last sentence was said as he turned his head to look at Perfected Idol Month. At that moment, the atmosphere in the hall was so cold and quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Perfected Idol Month slowly stood up and stared at Perfected Qian Deng. After a moment, she said in a deep voice, "There are still a few who haven't arrived yet. It won't be too late to wait." Perfected Qian Deng shook his head and said, "Senior Brother Sect Master, forgive me for speaking bluntly. We've waited for too long. Those who haven't arrived yet won't come. There's no need to waste any more time." A series of gasps could be vaguely heard from the surrounding nascent souls. All of them looked over with complicated expressions. Perfected Idol Month narrowed her eyes and looked coldly at Perfected Qian Deng. She said in a cold voice, "Junior Brother Qian Deng, do you mean that you don't even want to wait for my master Hakushin Jinkuan?" As soon as these words came out, the surrounding people's breathing seemed to stop. Everyone's gaze fell on Perfected Qian Deng. Chapter 234. The heavy rain did not stop, the dense forest was pitch black. One could not even see one's fingers if one stretched out one's hand. Right now even the dense foliage above their heads could not block the seemingly endless water flow. Everywhere like a broken dam, large waves of water flowed down from the top of the trees. The two figures hidden in the darkness, after the initial shock, quickly quietened down. This forest was so dark that they could not even see each other's faces clearly, also could not see the expression on the person beside them. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen lowered his voice and said, "The pattern on the back of the tree bark, was it drawn by you?" White Lotus's body shook slightly, seemed surprised again, after a moment of hesitation said, "No." This time it was Lu Chen who was stunned, and before he could continue to question, White Lotus had already said, "That pattern was not drawn by you." Lu Chen was speechless, looked up at the blurry and petite figure in front of him. At this moment, he felt that he could not see White Lotus's face clearly. Everything about this young girl seemed to be more and more mysterious and strange. "It was also not me." Lu Chen quickly denied, took a deep breath and said, "Then why are you here?" White Lotus instead asked, "I also wanted to ask you this question. That pattern is obviously an extremely rare secret pattern in the evil sect. Outsiders are not even able to know about it. How did you know about it, and why are you here?" Lu Chen did not speak. White Lotus also very quickly quietened down. Both of their bodies hibernating in the darkness, suddenly moved back a little at the same time, distancing themselves from each other. Lu Chen turned his head, glanced at the big tree in the forest. After a moment of silent contemplation, he made a decision in his heart. Even though White Lotus looked sincere, even though she was only a child, but this girl's words could not be trusted. To coincidentally come here at this night, it was impossible to say that it had nothing to do with the evil sect. This girl must have some great secret on her. Just when he had made up his mind and prepared to move, suddenly his body shook violently, almost fell down, and then in that darkness, black flames suddenly ignited in his eyes. A cold murderous intent uncontrollably rose up. White Lotus almost instantly sensed this biting cold murderous intent. With a cold snort, took 2 steps back, facing Lu Chen with full vigilance. But Lu Chen did not make a move. Instead, with a trace of bewilderment, turned his head, looked into the depths of the darkness. That was the depths of Kunlun Mountain, the legendary place where the sky and clouds were. Just now, he suddenly felt an extremely familiar aura coming from that direction, directly resonating with the black fire hidden in the deepest part of his body, causing the black fire in his body to instantly rise, almost unable to be suppressed. The black flame swayed in the distance in the dark forest, as if there was an extremely strong but from the same source, attracting this black flames. Between the sky and clouds, the winter peak was shrouded in fog. An incomparably powerful aura seeped out of the thick fog. A figure as huge as a mountain was faintly discernible in the fog. Gradually, a huge head approached the cliff on the winter peak. Its true appearance was gradually revealed from the dense fog. It was a huge dragon head, completely black, with long and tough dragon whiskers swaying in the wind, like two long black whips. Snow-white fangs faintly appeared in the dragon's mouth, emitting a cold glint. The most terrifying thing was that the pair of huge dragon eyes didn't have pupils. Instead, they were burning with a strange black flame. It looked like a demon that had suddenly leaped out from the netherworld. It slowly rose in front of the winter peak and appeared in front of everyone on the winter peak in a horrifying manner. The huge and frightening dragon eyes looked down from above. The place where it appeared was right behind True Lord Tianlan, and at that moment, the dragon's head could even be said to be right above True Lord Tianlan's head. As long as it lowered its head slightly, it could swallow True Lord Tianlan, who looked extremely small in comparison, in one gulp. However, True Lord Tianlan did not seem to be on guard at all. He still stood there calmly, his wide sleeves fluttering in the wind. At this moment, both he and the unimaginably terrifying dragon that had suddenly appeared were looking at the person on the snow-covered ground in front of them, Hakushin Jinkuan. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression suddenly changed the moment the black figure appeared. His usually calm face showed a rare expression of inconceivable astonishment. Then, all kinds of expressions intertwined on his face, complicated and incomprehensible. Even his body faintly trembled. It was not fear but rage. He withdrew his gaze from the terrifying black dragon and stared at Tianlan. He gritted his teeth and said in a hoarse voice, How did you do it? How dare you do this?" True Lord Tianlan's expression did not change, and he looked calm as if he had always had a clear conscience. He turned a deaf ear to Hakushin Jinkuan's questions. The black dragon's head above his head swayed slightly, and a dull sound that sounded like it was tearing through the air sounded. It was as if the dragon's power was so powerful that even the slightest movement would cause a chain reaction. It was truly unimaginable how powerful the black dragon would be if it were to completely rage and attack. Upon seeing that Tianlan did not reply, Hakushin Jinkuan seemed to become even more furious. However, just as he was about to flare up again, something even stranger happened. The black dragon's head, which was high up in the sky, suddenly stretched forward. The black flames in the dragon's eyes burned as if they were reflecting by Chen's figure. Immediately after, the dragon's mouth opened, and a deep, thunderous voice suddenly came from the snowstorm. It was the black dragon speaking in human language. "He's smarter than you." Hakushin Jinkuan suddenly raised his head and looked at the black dragon with a pale face. Then he laughed bitterly and said to True Lord Tianlan, "You're audacious, reckless, and rebellious. You've gone far beyond what Master and I warned you about back then. Now that things have come to this, you're actually arrogant enough to let this monster out. Aren't you afraid of being punished by the heavens?" When he said the last few words, Hakushin Jinkuan's voice was like thunder. Every word rumbled as if he wanted to shout angrily to wake up True Lord Tianlan in his eyes. However, Tianlan frowned slightly and said calmly, "This bewildering fog formation has already surrounded the sky. No matter how loudly you shout, it won't be heard." Hakushin Jinkuan's expression was solemn. Suddenly, his expression turned cold as he said, "I've lived for a long time and have enjoyed all kinds of honor and glory. It's nothing even if I die here today. But I just want to ask you one thing, junior brother. Why are you acting so recklessly without any regard for anything else?" He shook his head in pain and pointed at his chest. "Could it be that you've done so many things just to fight with me and kill me?" True Lord Tianlan's expression was as calm as water. No changes could be seen in his heart. Even when Hakushin Jinkuan questioned him sternly, he did not reveal any expression of guilt, regret, or fear. He just stood there calmly and finally smiled. "Senior brother, you're old. You won't understand me," he said indifferently. "No one in this world will understand what I want to do. I don't expect you to understand me either. In life, a good man should do what he wants. Even if the sky falls and the earth shatters, he should still look down on everyone and do as he pleases. Tianlong didn't say these words out loud, but Bai Chen could tell from his expression and eyes that he was serious. They had been brothers for so many years. No one in this world would understand this junior brother better than him. If there was someone, it would probably be their master, ancestor Tianhong, who had already passed away. Hakushin Jinkuan did not say anything else. After taking a deep breath, the anger on his face quickly dissipated. Wind and snow appeared behind him and gradually condensed into a white snowstorm. The pride and power of a divine transformation stage true lord would never end so easily. The withered old man straightened his back and looked coldly at the burly bald man in front of him as well as the even more terrifying black dragon. He suddenly sneered and said proudly, "Do you think that releasing the black dragon and plotting against me will make me bow down to you?" The black fire in the black dragon's huge eyes flickered and seemed to burn brightly. However, true Lord Tianlong, who was below the dragon's head, stared at Hakushin Jinkuan for a moment and suddenly shook his head. "Senior brother, you're afraid." Hakushin Jinkuan was furious and shouted, "Nonsense! I have the protection of the mountain spirit on this winter peak today. Although that evildoer is ferocious, he has been suppressed for thousands of years. How can he have any combat power or divine ability? Come, let's fight to the death. It's still unknown who will emerge victorious." True Lord Tianlong smiled and slowly waved one of his arms. The thick fog floating behind him suddenly retreated and even the huge dragon's head looked down at him. An incomparably tyrannical power slowly emanated from his body. It was pure yang and as warm as the sun. At first, there was a faint golden light. Then, the light grew brighter and brighter like the rising sun with thousands of golden rays. The endless wind and snow melted and retreated in front of this golden light. He was like a god in the golden light and a blazing yang qi gushed out, making it hard for people to look at him directly. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression changed drastically. His pupils constricted and he said bitterly, "Positive yang art. You've actually mastered it." In the golden light, a scorching yang qi rose, forming a sharp contrast with the icy wind and snow on Hakushin Jinkuan's side. Within the light, true Lord Tianlan's deep voice sounded indifferently. "Master has long said that I'm much more talented than you in terms of cultivation." Right after he said that, the golden light shone brightly and pounced towards Hakushin Jinkuan. Hakushin Jinkuan roared furiously and the wind and snow howled as well. The two perfected lords finally began their final battle in the deep fog of the night. Chapter 235. The light of the rising sun shone brightly. Everywhere it passed, not only did the ice and snow melt, even the rocks and soil under the white snow cracked. A brilliant aura seemed to carry a trace of a domineering aura that was above all things as it rushed over unstoppably. Looking at this golden pillar of light, Hakushin Jinkuan's expression was unusually grim. He took a step back and the surrounding snow and wind immediately stirred up, turning into a blizzard to meet it. The blazing sun and the blizzard, one hot and one cold, one bright and one dark, one yang and one yin, like the two extremes of heaven and earth, like water and fire, collided in an instant. At the very beginning, the two completely different rays of light were locked in a stalemate in midair, constantly melting, dissolving, and constantly surging up. The surrounding space began to distort intensely, and even strange rainbow-colored lights began to appear in the scorching sun, wind and snow, as well as ear-piercing screeches. After a while, the blizzard began to recede and the blazing sun gradually became more dazzling, pressing forward step by step. Black flames flickered in the eyes of the black dragon in the sky, but it was impossible to tell what it was feeling. Instead, Zhuoxian, who had been hiding in a corner after being clearly frightened by the appearance of the black dragon, came to his senses at this moment and revealed a hint of joy on his face. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression changed slightly. Then with a soft cry, he took a few steps back and leaned his back against an ice wall. In an instant, there was a sudden ka-ka-ka-ka sound and the ice on the mountain wall cracked and fell. White smoke surged out of the mountain rock and seeped into Hakushin Jinkuan's body. As the white smoke entered his body, Hakushin Jinkuan's eyes shone brightly. The blizzard howled wildly and actually rolled back, pushing back the previously unstoppable radiance of the rising sun. Streaks of ice and snow condensed on the ground and in the air, as if the temperature in the air had instantly dropped to an extremely low point. Even the snowflakes had turned into ice cubes, and the blizzard that filled the sky was turning into hail. The white frost was unstoppable, suppressing the scorching light along the way and approaching Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was indifferent, as if he was not too surprised or angry by the instant reversal of the situation. He merely stretched out his other hand and pressed it in front of him, drawing a circle with his other hand. Strong pure yang qi overflowed from his palm and directly formed a fire shield in front of him. The white frost pressed forward but was once again blocked in front of the fire shield and could not advance any further. Even so, Hakushin Jinkuin had the upper hand. He had been paying attention to the huge black dragon all this while. However, the black dragon did not move at all from the beginning to the end. Regardless of whether Tianlan had the upper hand or reversed the situation and fell into a disadvantageous position, the black dragon had no intention of attacking. In the Kunlun sect, only Bai Chen and Tianlan knew the secret of the underground palace under the forbidden area. Apart from Tianlan, there was practically no one who knew more about this terrifying monster than Perfected Lord Bai Chen. Apart from Tianlan, almost no one knew more about this terrifying monster than Hakushin Jinkuin. He knew that this monster should not have woken up. It should have been trapped in that dark place, never to rise again. It had been sealed in the darkness for 5,000 years. Would it really be as terrifying as it was back then when it suddenly woke up? At least for now, it seemed that this black dragon was just an empty shell that only had the looks of it. Hakushin Jinkuin's spirits were lifted. If that was really the case, the situation that he originally thought was certain defeat and death today actually had a chance to turn around. Although junior brother Tianlan was indeed extremely powerful, attacking on this winter peak was his biggest mistake. He could even force the demonic dragon back into the underground palace after killing Tianlan. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Hakushin Jinkuin had already thought of many things. However, although Perfected Lord Tianlan was temporarily at a disadvantage, he relied on the fire shield in front of him to defend himself. No matter how Hakushin Jinkuin urged his Taoist skills and magic powers, the frost and snow that could freeze ordinary people to death countless times still could not break through the fire shield's defense and could not advance any further. The Zhangyang tactic was indeed the world's best magical Taoist skill. It was upright and pure, with a faint aura of the way of the king. It became stronger the stronger it was, and its defense was incomparably tight. However, such an extraordinary magical skill was obtained by junior brother Tianlan. Hakushin Jinkuin seemed to suddenly think of something. His expression turned ugly. He stared at Perfected Lord Tianlan with a murderous look in his eyes. Suddenly, he let out a long roar and flew into the air. With a shake of his arms, it was as if infinite spiritual power suddenly jumped on the entire winter peak, causing a deafening roar. Countless white smoke floated out from the tall winter peak, wisps and wisps, swam towards Hakushin Jinkuin in the air. Following the gathering of the white smoke, the entire winter peak seemed to have come alive. It seemed to have become one with the skinny Hakushin Jinkuin in the air, breathing together, vibrating together. Right now the mountain was the man was the mountain. Hakushin Jinkuin was like the incarnation of the mountain god, looking down at Tianlan. Suddenly he laughed loudly, raised his hand and chopped down. At that moment, there seemed to be an illusion in the night sky. The winter peak turned into an incomparably huge giant, slapped down with his palm, wanting to crush the ant under his palm. But Perfected Lord Tianlan still did not have much expression on his face. He was still desperately supporting the fire shield, resisting little by little Hakushin Jinkuin's terrifying and crazy attack. Just when the outcome was about to be decided, suddenly in the depths of the mist, a huge and terrifying shadow appeared. With an indescribable speed, it flew over. It was a huge black claw. It was the black dragon's second claw. The black dragon's claw tore through the endless wind and snow, piercing straight into the snowstorm like the palm of a giant. Before anyone could react, there was a muffled bang. With a muffled grunt, Hakushin Jinkuin was sent flying by the claw. He somersaulted a few times in the air, then crashed heavily into the snow with a poof. Half of his body even pierced into the snow. At the same time, the peerlessly powerful black dragon that had just launched a successful sneak attack slowly retracted its claw. Then, its whiskers undulated as it said calmly, "I heard that you thought I wasn't powerful just now?" The black dragon sneered and even flicked its huge claw. Then, it lowered its head and said to Perfected Lord Tianlan, "How was it?" Because Hakushin Jinkuin had been sent flying, Perfected Lord Tianlan, who had just been suppressed by the mountain range's spirit chi, finally heaved a sigh of relief. Just then, he heard the black dragon's question. Perfected Lord Tianlong glanced at the black dragon and sneered. Just as a... Black flames flashed in the black dragon's eyes, but it did not say anything, nor did it do anything harmful to Perfected Lord Tianlong. Instead, it slowly raised its head and said, Kuan Yuanzi and Tai Luo are not good people. They are unwilling to tell their descendants anything. They probably forgot to tell you that the one in the underground palace is a petty dragon. Perfected Lord Tianlong chuckled. I understand now. The black flames in the black dragon's eyes flickered. It turned its head and looked in Hakushin Jinkuan's direction again. By now, Hakushin Jinkuan had somewhat regained consciousness and slowly stood up from the snow. However, after receiving that heavy blow, Hakushin Jinkuan's condition was terrible. Not only was his clothes in disarray, blood could be seen everywhere from his wounds and between his nose and mouth. He looked extremely wretched. However, before he could regain his composure, a whistling sound suddenly rang out from the sky and a huge black claw smashed down. On the ground in front of him, a dazzling, scorching radiance once again roused itself. This time, it was even more intense than before as it struck down towards him. Tianlong and the black dragon had no intention of giving Hakushin Jinkuan any chance to catch his breath. Seeing that the soul-chasing killing move was right in front of him, Hakushin Jinkuan suddenly roared angrily. His clothes instantly tore apart and all the ice and snow on his hands, feet and body rose into the air, blocking the two monsters' powerful strength. However, the enemy he was facing was too powerful. Or rather, it could be said that not only were they powerful, they were also exceptionally cunning, decisive and determined. The black dragon's giant claws kept smashing at the snowstorm. Every time its claws landed, a large piece of snow and ice would be shaken away. On the other side, Lord Tianlong was silently activating the positive yang tactic with all his might. With a terrifying power that could melt hard iron, he corroded the snowstorm one after another. Hakushin Jinkuan tried his best to resist, but as time went on, it was no longer a long-term solution. Seeing that he was being pressured by the two terrifying forces and had to absorb the terrifying amount of white smoke, he began to tremble at some point in time. After that, he suddenly heard a loud bang. Bai Chen's body suddenly flew backward, and she slammed heavily into the stone wall the next moment. Immediately, ice shards danced in the air, and shattered snowflakes fell from the sky with a hint of desolation. The outcome had been decided. Hakushin Jinkuan was bleeding from his 7 orifices. He was severely injured, but even so, his will seemed to be as firm as steel. He slowly stood up. He opened his blood-stained eyes, panting and laughing bitterly. Suddenly, a hint of madness flashed across his face. With a backhand slap, he directly pounced on the mountain wall with his flesh and blood. The white smoke frantically surged into his body, but Hakushin Jinkuan did not stand up again. He only looked up at the sky and laughed maniacally. He roared, "You're delusional enough to want my immortal cave abode? Dream on!" Boom! A strange sound came from the winter peak. Perfected Lord Tianlong suddenly raised his head and glanced at the peak of the mountain. His expression instantly became abnormally ugly. The huge mountain was no longer affected by the snowstorm, but everything on the mountain seemed to have shattered at this moment. Rocks of various sizes kept falling from the mountain. However, the rumbling thunder did not come from the clouds in the sky. Instead, it came from within the winter peak. Hakushin Jinkuan laughed maniacally. "You're still coveting my treasures? Dream on, junior brother. What I will give you is only a collapsed ruin." He roared furiously. All of a sudden, Bai Chen's entire body swelled up and kept expanding. When he reached a certain size, his flesh and blood suddenly exploded, turning into countless splatters of blood. At the same time, the entire winter peak shook violently. Immediately after, a large amount of dust rose into the sky. More and more rocks fell from the mountain. The ground began to crack, and the entire mountain began to collapse. One of the peerless peaks in the sky actually collapsed and fell to the ground today. Chapter 236. A cry that seemed to have come from ancient times reverberated between the heavens and the earth, causing all living creatures to tremble. It was a huge roar that burst forth from the depths of the huge winter peak when it collapsed. At the same time, Countless strong rays of light shot out from the mountain, rushing towards the boundless world of darkness in all directions. It was a spiritual light that was condensed from pure and powerful spiritual power. It pierced through all obstacles. At this moment, even the layers of thick fog could not stop the powerful force that erupted at the final moment of the Spirit Mountain's destruction. For a moment, the light was so dazzling that it reached the vault of heaven, illuminating half of the night sky. Large chunks of boulders and rock strata were constantly breaking and collapsing. The entire winter peak was slowly falling, followed by a terrifying storm of dust. The towering Kunlun mountain range, which stretched for thousands of miles, seemed to be trembling non-stop at this moment. The earth also seemed to be wailing. After a moment, the collapse of the winter peak became faster and faster. The smoke and dust grew larger and higher. Just as the floating mountain was about to be completely submerged by the smoke and dust, dozens of dazzling spiritual lights suddenly converged into a scorching, dazzling, and huge pillar of light that flickered and shot straight into the sky. In an instant, the wind blew away the clouds, and the sky changed color. All the dark clouds retreated in front of this pillar of light. Countless gusts of wind and clouds turned into a huge whirlpool that spun rapidly in the air. Darkness and light intertwined, flashing with silver lightning that tore apart the night sky. Then, accompanied by an earth-shattering noise, a wave of light surged in all directions like a raging wave. All the dark clouds were scattered, and the wind and rain suddenly stopped. In the deep and gloomy night, in this originally stormy night, the wind and rain suddenly stopped. Then, a rare yet strangely enchanting scene appeared in the middle of the night. A bright moonlight sprinkled down from the vault of heaven. In the pitch-black night sky, a full moon hung above the 9 heavens. It was full and perfect, dazzling, cold and peerless, and radiated light in all directions. It was as if everything in this world had lost its color. On the night of the full moon, this full moon finally appeared above the vault of heaven. As soon as the full moon appeared, the dense fog seemed to be suddenly stimulated. It suddenly shrank and began to shrink back into the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlan, who had already flown into the air, stood in the void with his hands behind his back. A strong gust of wind blew past him, causing his loose robes to flutter loudly. He looked like an immortal. Beneath his feet was the ruins of the winter peak amidst a sea of dust. The majestic peak seemed to have turned into the tomb of a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, sacrificing his body to protect him. Tianlan was not angry about this. His expression was unexpectedly calm as he silently stared at the cold moon in the sky. It was said that when one was at the peak, they would feel lonely and cold. Nobody knew how perfected Lord Tianlan felt at that moment. The huge black dragon in the dense fog had retreated and disappeared at some point. It seemed that it did not like such a strong and bright moonlight. Its huge body had also disappeared into the darkness without a sound. Xiaofan, who was a little below perfected Lord Tianlan, also flew into the air. He looked at the destroyed winter peak with a complicated expression. Finally, he seemed to sigh. Then, with a respectful expression, he lowered his head slightly towards perfected Lord Tianlan and waited patiently. Just like how he had been patient when he was under perfected Lord Bai Chen all these years. He had shown sufficient sincerity and submission. In fact, he was even more patient than before. Because the situation was no longer the same as before. In Kunlun, there was no other deity transformation stage perfected cultivator who could compete with the one in front of him. That night, almost every place in Kunlun was shocked by this sudden scene. Everyone, whether they were insiders or not, was shaken to the core. When the earth began to shake, everyone was frightened. When the loud noise resounded through the heavens and earth, everyone felt that they were in danger. In the end, when the wind and rain suddenly stopped and the moonlight shone down, everyone was dumbfounded. In the Zhangyang Hall of Mount Tiankuan, the 10 or so Yuanying perfected cultivators who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world were all standing in front of the windows and doorways with different emotions. They looked at the terrifying scene of the winter peak falling after the dense fog in the distance dispersed. No one said anything, or perhaps no one knew what to say or what to say. Since ancient times, it seemed that something that would never change had been destroyed in front of their eyes. Therefore, when the cold moonlight shone on them again and shone into the side hall, every Yuanying perfected cultivator seemed to feel a chill. Perfected Master Idlemonth was dumbfounded. His face was filled with astonishment and horror. His usual calmness had completely vanished at this moment. Such an earth-shattering event was right in front of them. The mountain peak that symbolized the supreme power of Kunlun had suddenly collapsed in front of them. Who could remain calm? Suddenly, perfected Master Idlemonth came to his senses. He immediately stood up and roared, "Quick! Let's go to the winter peak to save the people." There was a commotion in the hall. For a moment, nearly half of the nascent soul-perfected masters took a step forward. But at this moment, suddenly, there was a slightly cold, abnormally calm and even somewhat grim voice that reverberated in the side hall. "Wait!" Everyone was shocked. They turned around and saw that the person who spoke was perfected Master Chen Deng, who was seated below perfected Master Idlemonth. In the midst of the chaos, this great perfected master, who held a high position in the Kunlun party, had unexpectedly returned to his seat. He sat steadily, calmly, as if he was an old tree that had taken root, not moving an inch. There was not the slightest trace of shock on his face at this moment. His face was calm as he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Senior brothers and junior brothers, I think we should start this small meeting. As for those who haven't arrived yet, there's no need to wait any longer." As soon as these words came out, the crowd suddenly burst into an uproar. Even though each and every one of the Yuanying perfected masters were well-mannered, their faces changed at this moment. They looked at perfected Master Chen Deng in horror. "You!" Perfected Master Idlemonth was filled with anger. He pointed at perfected Master Chen Deng and was so angry that he couldn't speak for a moment. Even his fingers seemed to be trembling. At this time, someone beside him also came back to his senses and immediately rebuked perfected Master Chen Deng for not seeing the big picture. Perfected Master Chen Deng didn't defend himself. He waited for the surrounding people to quiet down a little before he calmly said, "Marshal Uncle Tianlon will be here in a while. When that time comes, it's up to you to decide what to do and what to do next." After saying this, he closed his eyes and no longer spoke. The surrounding hall instantly fell into a deathly silence. Perfected Master Idlemonth's face was ashen. His body slightly trembled and a trace of despair finally appeared in his eyes. The cold moonlight sprinkled on the hall's floor, like frost and snow. The speed at which the weather changed was simply inconceivable on this night. A moment ago, it was still raining cats and dogs, and in the next moment, the clouds suddenly parted and the rain dispersed, revealing a bright moon hanging high in the sky. It truly caught one off guard. In the dense forest, from the darkness where one couldn't even see their own fingers in front of them to the sudden disappearance of the water flow and the sprinkling of moonlight, it only took a moment. In the moonlight, Lu Chen and White Lotus suddenly saw each other. They were both taken aback and took a step back. Lu Chen looked up and saw an unusually bright round moon hanging in the sky. He was extremely shocked, but what shocked him even more was that in the depths of Kunlun Mountain, the mysterious power that resonated with the black fire in his body had actually reached an unimaginable level of intensity. White Lotus suddenly cried out in alarm and took 2 steps back. Then she pointed at Lu Chen and said in surprise, You, what's wrong with your eyes? Why is there a black fire burning?" Lu Chen was shocked. This black fire was his most meticulously guarded secret. It could be said that in this world, other than the mute black dog, almost no one had seen or knew about this black fire. At this moment, under the stimulation and attraction of that strange power, he actually couldn't control the power in his body for a moment. The black fire surged up and suddenly appeared in his eyes. Revealing the black fire in his eyes, such a strange appearance, looked like a ghost. Obviously, it was not a supernatural power that could be possessed by the Kunlun party. At that moment, thoughts turned in Lu Chen's mind. The murderous intent on his body fluctuated silently. But at this moment, White Lotus's expression changed slightly. Suddenly, her body shook and she looked into the distance. She saw the huge change that seemed like the sky was falling and the earth was splitting. She saw the scene of the winter peak falling and collapsing. She seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then she let out a scream and shouted, "Teacher!" Before her voice died away, her whole body shot out like lightning and rushed in the direction of the collapsed winter peak. Her body was so fast that after a few turns in the forest, she was about to disappear from his line of sight. When Lu Chen saw her body move, his face darkened. He subconsciously took a step forward, as if he wanted to make a move. At that moment, a cold wind suddenly blew in the forest. Drops of moisture and water splashed everywhere. A cold light flashed in the eyes of White Lotus, who was in the middle of running, and she seemed to look in his direction. A faint light was faintly discernible in the palm of her hand. In Lu Chen's eyes, the black fire burned fiercely. The moment the two of them brushed past each other, they both seemed to hold their breaths and did not move. It was as if they were overflowing with killing intent, but in the end, they slowly suppressed it. In that inexplicable moment, the two of them separated in the blink of an eye. White Lotus flew away and did not look back. Lu Chen watched the young girl's back disappear into the darkness of the night. Then, he slowly turned around and looked at the earth-shattering change under the bright moonlight in the distance. His expression was complicated. After an unknown amount of time, he raised his head to look at the bright moon in the horizon. Suddenly, he turned around and walked outside. There was a low sigh from his mouth, as if a question of doubt was left in this dark forest. "Why didn't you come?" Chapter 237. Kunlun Mountain. Outside the Fragrance Garden's guest room, Xian stood under the eaves, looking at the bright moon in the sky. Her pretty face was filled with astonishment. It could be said that she was dumbstruck. Not long ago, she was still looking at the heavy rain and wind outside, with some hidden bitterness in her heart. In the end, in the blink of an eye, the rain stopped and the dark clouds dispersed, revealing the bright moon hanging high in the sky. She had lived for more than 10 years and had never seen such a strange phenomenon. For a moment, she felt that her brain couldn't wrap around it. After looking at it for a moment, suddenly, she heard a cry from the guest room behind her. It was Sumo crying out, and his voice carried a sense of extreme pain. Xian was shocked and quickly turned around to look from the windowsill. She saw that on the bed in the guest room, Sumo's eyes were still closed, but the muscles on his face were twisted, as if he had fallen into a terrible nightmare. His body kept twisting on the bed, his legs kicking randomly, his hands tightly hugging his head, and his mouth was shouting nonsense that no one could understand. Waves of painful cries in the middle of the night really made one's hair stand on end. Xian didn't know what was going on, but that person was after all entrusted to her care by Su Qingjun, so she couldn't just watch and ignore him. So, Xian hurriedly ran to the door, pushed it open and ran in. She came to the bed and pressed down hard on Sumo, at the same time calling out his name, hoping that she could wake up Sumo from his nightmare. But Sumo seemed to be deep in a nightmare. No matter how Xian shouted, he didn't seem to hear it. He just desperately hugged his head and twisted his body, crying and shouting something, and finally even began to tear and scratch his body. Xian was shocked and quickly reached out to press down on Sumo's hand, but Sumo's strength seemed to be much stronger than usual in this kind of dream. There were a few times when Xian almost couldn't hold him down, but fortunately Sumo's consciousness wasn't clear, and he didn't deliberately hurt Xian. After repeatedly struggling for a long time, Sumo's pain seemed to slowly subside. His cries then calmed down, and his expression seemed to be more comfortable, no longer twisted in pain. At this moment, Xian was so tired that her forehead was full of sweat. Seeing Sumo like this, she really felt relieved. She straightened up and let out a long breath, wiping the sweat off her forehead. She looked at Sumo again, only to see that the man still hadn't opened his eyes, lying on the bed as if he had fallen asleep again. Xian unhappily curled her lips and muttered, "So troublesome." As she said that, she casually pulled the quilt over and covered him. She looked around again, and after feeling that there was nothing else, she walked out of the door and came to the corridor outside the house. Because of the sudden appearance of the bright moon, and on this full moon night, the moonlight was unusually bright, as if it was daytime. The night seemed to be even brighter than before. Xian looked at the moonlight, and then looked in the direction of the clouds in the sky. Her expression became a little worried, and she whispered to herself, "Such a big thing happened. Even if Sister Su and the others are on the way back, they must have rushed to Dongfeng to help. Really, how could such a thing happen?" Pa! Just as she was talking to herself, a sudden crisp sound came from behind her, startling Xian. She turned around and saw that the two windows of the guest room seemed to have been blown shut by the wind. Xian frowned and snorted. Suddenly, she felt a little cold, but she didn't think too much about it. It was probably because the night was too cold. She stretched out her hand to tighten the lapels of her clothes, but she suddenly remembered that long ago in the land of confusion, when Lu Chen brought her and Atsu to travel through the barren mountains and wild rivers. A faint warmth flashed through her heart, and a trace of a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. She smiled so sweetly, but she completely didn't notice that there was suddenly a shadow quietly surging up behind her, pouncing towards her back. A strange phenomenon suddenly occurred on Kunlun Mountain. The torrential rain instantly dissipated, and a bright moon appeared in the sky. Such a strange phenomenon did not only occur on the mountain. Even Kunwu City at the foot of the mountain was affected for a moment. However, because they were too far away from the mountain, the people in Kunwu City couldn't see the shocking scene of Dongfeng collapsing. Even so, it was already shocking enough. The two people with the highest status among the demon cult of the three realms hiding in Kunwu City were undoubtedly Fan Tue and Chen He. At this moment, they were standing on the rooftop of their houses and looking at the dark Kunlun Mountain in the distance. They had shocked expressions on their faces. Under the night sky, Kunlun Mountain appeared unusually mysterious. Even though they couldn't see the scene of Dongfeng collapsing in the dense fog zone, the huge pillar of light that shot into the sky was still too eye-catching. It was impossible for them not to see it. Fan Tue muttered, "What exactly happened on this mountain? Why is there such a strange phenomenon?" Chen He shook his head and said, "I don't know. This is also the first time I've seen such a shocking phenomenon in my life." Fan Tue's expression suddenly changed. He said to Chen He, "Could it be that the mysterious brother in the Kunlun party has done something shocking?" Chen He was stunned for a moment. A strange expression appeared on his face. He wanted to deny it, but after thinking about it carefully, he didn't dare to deny it so recklessly. In the end, he could only let out a bitter laugh and said, "I really don't dare to make wild guesses about this. However, something big must have happened on the mountain that we don't know about." After a moment of silence, Fan Tue suddenly clasped his hands together and said, "Such a shocking phenomenon must be extraordinary. If a treasure has appeared, it must be a rare treasure or an ancient divine weapon. If someone has mastered a technique and displayed a strange phenomenon, it must be a divine technique or a divine weapon. No matter what, we can't ignore it. I'll immediately mobilize people to rush here, and order our spies on the mountain to investigate and see what exactly happened to the Kunlun party." Chen He thought for a moment and said, "That's fine too." After saying that, he seemed to have sensed something and turned his head to look around. Under the night sky, he saw that on the roofs and walls of many houses in Kunwu City, there were some indistinct figures standing on high places. They were all looking in the direction of the Kunlun mountain range. Clearly, they were also alarmed by the strange phenomenon that had happened not long ago. In a place even further away from Kunwu City, on a nameless mountain peak in the wilderness, the long and narrow slope at the top of the mountain was littered with the corpses of demonic beasts. Blood flowed everywhere, and flesh was badly mutilated. It was a terrifying scene that resembled the purgatory of the underworld. At the highest point of the mountain peak, on top of a large rock, this most primitive, most barbaric and most undisguised life and death battle, which was beyond the line of sight of humans, had also reached its final moment. The black dog had bitterly held on until the very last moment. It had blocked off all the greedy demonic beasts that coveted its flesh and blood. It had kicked and bitten to death every obstacle that blocked its path. When it finally reached the highest point of the mountain peak, the sky was raging with a storm. The moon on the night of the full moon that it had been looking forward to the most was nowhere to be seen. Fate was like an evil hand, tightly clutching the black dog's throat, making it unable to breathe, making it groan in pain, making it struggle madly, making it feel like success was within reach, but it seemed like it was about to fall short of success at the last moment. No one could endure such painful torture. It was the same for dogs. The black dog angrily and even madly roared at the pitch-black rain, but it was of no use. As the last of its strength gradually disappeared in the cold wind and rain, the two demonic beasts below, who had been waiting until the very last moment with terrifying patience and astonishing strength, finally began to slowly walk forward. The greedy aura could no longer be suppressed, and the sound of salivating could be heard. Atsu had lost all its strength, and even the blood on its body seemed to be about to run dry. It could only fall to the ground, no longer looking at the ferocious demonic beasts that were closing in on it. Instead, it stared blankly at the dark sky, not even making a sound. Just like that, it silently waited for the arrival of death. The only eye of the black dog was shining with a lonely green light. Perhaps at this moment, it was still thinking about Lu Chen. Perhaps it was still thinking about how wonderful it would be to be able to stay by his side. A scarlet tongue and gleaming fangs drew close to Atu with heavy panting. Atu struggled for a while, but still fell to the ground. Everything seemed to be destined. Until in the night sky, in the boundless darkness, suddenly, a ray of light fell. A ray of bright moonlight. The dark clouds dispersed, the wind and rain stopped, and the bright moon leaped out from behind the dark clouds, hanging high in the night sky. The cold and clear moonlight sprinkled down quietly. Whether it was Atsu or the ferocious demonic beasts, they all looked up at the sky in horror. But after a moment, suddenly, a dull and strange sound came from the black dog. It was a kind of crack sound, like the sound of bones rubbing against each other. Under the moonlight, it was so clear that it was a little scary. Atsu suddenly raised its head, and the green flame in its eyes gradually brightened. The greedy demonic beasts, who were close at hand, suddenly began to tremble slightly. They felt a strong aura that they had never felt before, suddenly emanating from the seemingly dying black dog in front of them. The cold night wind blew, and all things crawled. The black dog's body made strange sounds one after another, as if all the bones in its body had been broken, and then reconnected themselves. The aura was like that of a king, looking down on the world, with no one in his eyes. The black dog slowly stood up. The bright moon in the sky sprinkled a beam of light, shining right on its body, wrapping it in the moonlight, and shining spots of light rose up. All the wounds on its body suddenly began to heal at a speed visible to the naked eye. Its muscles bulged and contracted, and its body seemed to be expanding rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had grown to the size of a lion or tiger. Atsu's spirit was quickly recovering, and it even glanced coldly at the two demonic beasts that retreated. With two wails, the demonic beasts fled, leaving behind a mess of blood on the ground. Atsu seemed to be disdainful, not caring at all. It stood at the highest point of the mountain, looking up at the sky. Suddenly, it raised its head to the moon, and let out a long and mournful howl. The sound shook the wilderness and echoed between heaven and earth. Oh woo! Chapter 238. Lu Chen left the dense forest, feeling a little tired. No matter who it was, even if he was once a top-notch shadow in the dark world, had experienced the harshest environments and encounters, and had practiced some strange techniques that ordinary people could not imagine, as long as he was human, hiding in the dark soil for 2 days would not be an easy thing to do. At this time, the bright moon hung high in the sky, and the night suddenly became clear. Lu Chen's clothes were very dirty because of the things that happened in the dense forest, and it was even more obvious under the moonlight. However, this was not a difficult thing for him. In a remote corner not far from the forest, he took out the new clothes that he had prepared earlier and put them on. He looked like a new person, and even his complexion looked much better. Then, he walked into the distance, his eyes occasionally looking in the direction of the sky and clouds in the depths of Kunlun Mountain. The huge pillar of light that shot into the sky was too shocking, and there was nothing that could block it anymore. Looking at the spectacular scene of the huge winter peak collapsing and being engulfed by the huge smoke and dust, Lu Chen was also silently shocked. But very soon, his eyes once again fell on the top of the huge pillar of light that shot into the sky, piercing the clouds and changing the color of the sky. There was almost a black vortex that appeared faintly. For some reason, his heart suddenly trembled. This scene was very similar to the final scene of the god-subduing spell that the devil cult of the Three Realms had summoned at the end of the battle in the Barren Valley. Of course, at this time, although the sky was changing, there was no strange miraculous power like in the past, not to mention the terrifying eye that was hidden in the darkness like a demon. After walking for a while, Lu Chen saw many Kunlun disciples running out. In fact, according to the time, it was already late at night, and it was already the time of the Kunlun party's curfew. But what happened tonight was too big, and it was impossible for people to just sit in their rooms. More and more people appeared, and more people began to run in the direction of the winter peak. In the same direction, not only was the mysterious forbidden land in the sky and clouds, but also the main peak of the Kunlun party, Tiankuan Peak and Zhengyang Hall, were also there. It seemed that everyone was a little out of their wits and wanted to seek guidance from the elders in the sect. Is it because such a big thing happened that the damn Baldy didn't come? Lu Chen pondered in his heart, but at this moment, his heart was filled with doubts. He really did not know who to trust. How many people do you really trust in this world? The kind of friend that he could completely trust, that he would never betray him? The night breeze was slightly chilly, caressing his face. Lu Chen's footsteps suddenly came to a halt. After a while, he sighed softly, a complicated expression on his face. It was also at this moment that the figure of a young girl suddenly appeared in his mind. It was Xian. Her smiling face seemed to be the most heartwarming thing in this cold world. Lu Chen smiled for no reason, and actually felt a little better. He raised his head again to look at the bright moon. The moonlight was bright, and at this moment, the night was actually somewhat bright and beautiful. For some reason, he felt a little tired of the place where the crowd was running to. But he remembered how Xian looked when she said she would come to find him a few days ago. Her smile seemed to have never been so clear in his heart. Lu Chen turned around and then said to himself in a low voice, "Forget it, let's go see that silly girl." The location of the fragrance garden tea room and the guest room happened to be in the opposite direction of the sky and clouds, as well as Tiankuan Peak and other important places. When Lu Chen turned around and walked in that direction, he encountered many Kunlun disciples on the road. He was traveling in the opposite direction alone. Of course, he appeared to be out of the ordinary. However, it was currently night time and such a shocking event had happened. Almost all of the Kunlun disciples were in a state of panic. Hence, no one would pay attention to such an inconspicuous, ordinary character. In addition, along the way, Lu Chen tried to walk in the shadows of the roadside. Many people didn't even notice him and ran past him. Lu Chen secretly observed many people and found that many of them seemed to have gone to Tiankuan Peak's Zhangyang Hall to participate in the day's meeting. On their way back at night, such a big event suddenly happened, so they turned back one after another and rushed towards the collapsed mountain peak. What happened? What happened to Dongfeng Peak? Could it be that there are foreign enemies invading? Is there another big earthquake in the mountain? Along the way, Lu Chen didn't know how many questions like these were heard. Obviously, most of the Kunlun disciples still didn't know what had happened. After walking for about half of the journey, the front suddenly became empty. It seemed that most of the people had already rushed over, leaving only the dark houses and pavilions in front of him in silence in the night. Lu Chen remembered that Xian told him that she often stayed here these days because her master, Dongfeng Tao, often came here to drink tea and chat with Melaleuca japonica. It seemed that the two of them had an unusually deep friendship. But now, Lu Chen was only worried that Xian was silly. Although it was very lively in the sky, she also ran over to watch the fun. It didn't matter if he couldn't find Xian tonight, but he had a faint feeling that the damn Baldy was very likely to be there at this moment. In this world, the person that Lu Chen couldn't see through the most and was most afraid of was the damn Baldy who had raised him since he was young. No one understood that person's strength better than him, and no one knew better than him how ruthless that person could be when he really hardened his heart. Of course, it was unlikely that a peerless person like the damn Baldy would care about a little girl like Xian. However, the slightest ripple on the side of a true lord might be a monstrous wave to an ordinary person. Lu Chen didn't want Xian to be in any danger, so he still went over. When he walked near the fragrance garden tea house, he saw that the house was pitch black without any lights. It didn't seem like anyone was still staying inside. Presumably, the people who were originally here were either already asleep, or they had been alarmed by the strange changes on Winter Peak and had all run out. Could it be that they really sneaked over to watch the fun? Lu Chen frowned. Just as he was thinking about whether he should go back to Tiankuan Peak again, he suddenly heard a burst of footsteps from the side. Lu Chen turned his head to look, only to see that from the direction of the row of guest rooms on the other side of the tea house, in the same dark place, a figure suddenly ran out. His footsteps were a little unsteady, but his speed was very fast. With the help of the bright moonlight that night, Lu Chen clearly saw that person's face and was suddenly startled. He saw that this person was actually Sumo, but his expression seemed to be very strange. The muscles on his face were constantly twisting and twitching, and his eyes were also strangely red and white. At the same time, there were all kinds of expressions of fear and dread on his face, as if he had seen the most terrifying thing in the world, and he couldn't stop gasping for breath. When he ran out, Sumo seemed to also see Lu Chen standing alone on the other side. His footsteps slightly paused, and a trace of murderous intent floated in his eyes. Lu Chen's face darkened. He had been displeased with this young master Sumo for a long time. If it wasn't for that woman, Su Qingjun, he was afraid that he would have already made a move on Sumo. But in reality, even with Su Qingjun around, Lu Chen didn't really intend to completely let bygones be bygones with Sumo. He had asked old Ma to privately inquire about the daily whereabouts of the Su family just to vent his anger. So in this cold and cheerless night, when there was no one around, when Sumo seemed to show hostility towards him, not only did Lu Chen not shrink back in fear, but his eyes lit up and he suddenly took a step forward. But just when he was about to move, Sumo seemed to suddenly feel Lu Chen's murderous intent. This time, he suddenly became terrified, and with a strange cry, he actually turned around and ran. Lu Chen was stunned. He didn't think that this guy would actually run away so straightforwardly. He didn't even care about the face of an aristocratic family's disciple. If it was in the past, it seemed that Sumo wouldn't do such a thing. There was some doubt in his heart, but Lu Chen quickly frowned. After Sumo ran past, he smelled a faint smell of blood. His gaze focused, and he looked at Sumo's back. He saw that there was indeed a bloodstain on the man's right hand. Sumo quickly ran far away. Moreover, looking at the direction he ran in, he didn't go to Heavenly Kuan Peak or that lively place in the sky. Instead, he ran in the direction of going down the mountain. Could it be that this eccentric Su family's eldest young master is actually going back to his home in Kunwu City in the middle of the night? Lu Chen shook his head. After pondering for a moment, he finally gave up on the idea of tracking this person. Tonight was full of unusual phenomena, and a great change had taken place. There was no need to be anxious about such a small matter, so it was better not to complicate things. In the future, there would always be time to slowly find trouble with this guy. He turned around, ready to leave this place. Since Exian wasn't here, presumably, she also went to the sky to watch the fun. Needless to say, this kind of thing was indeed in line with Exian's temperament. Lu Chen could even imagine the very excited and impatient look on Exian's face when she called her friends. It was a little cute but also a little stupid. He smiled and walked forward. The sound of his footsteps moving forward in the dark night fell in this bleak courtyard. The ground was still wet, and there were many drops of water dripping down. It was probably the result of the heavy downpour not long ago. He stepped over a puddle of water, and his body suddenly stopped. In the darkness, there was a cold night wind blowing. A faint smell of blood drifted along with the wind. Lu Chen turned around. His gaze was a little cold as he glanced around. Then, he slowly looked at the dark room on the other side of the guest room. There were several deep winding corridors and many dripping eaves. He silently stood where he was for a moment, and then he walked over. The moonlight shone on his body, elongating a dark shadow. Chapter 239. The sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet courtyard and corridors. There was a chill in the cold night that seemed to linger on, just like this world that was always covered in darkness. But fortunately, there would always be sunlight after the night. Although there were many darkness, there would always be warmth in life. Lu Chen subconsciously tightened his clothes. He did not know why, but his heart was beating faster. He did not know why he thought of Exian. It hadn't been a long time since he had first met this girl, but they had experienced a lot of things. There were many times when Lu Chen felt that Exian was a bit stupid. He was used to looking down at her and teasing her, joking with her. But now that he thought about it, Lu Chen suddenly realized that in these days, every time Exian smiled at him, the sky was bright and the air was warm. It was never him taking care of her. It had always been that young girl giving warmth to the lonely shadow that was struggling in the cold darkness. She had unknowingly pulled him out of the darkness slightly, letting him feel that little bit of warmth under the light. Perhaps it was not much, but it was precious. It was like a ray of light shining through the dark clouds. Although it was not strong, it was enough to illuminate the darkness. He slowly walked forward. Suddenly, he saw a black shadow lying on the ground in the corridor. It was a person lying on the ground, motionless. The night was too dark and the moonlight could not shine here. It was faint and blurry. Lu Chen could not see the person's face, but his heart suddenly beat faster. He felt that the figure was somewhat familiar. His mouth was dry. Was it nervousness or fear? Lu Chen did not know and did not have time to think about it. He held his breath and slowly walked over. Suddenly, he found that the smell of blood in the surroundings suddenly became stronger. It was coming from the person lying on the ground. An ominous premonition slammed into his heart, but perhaps his years as a shadow had long tempered his will into steel. As if he had lost the soft emotions of an ordinary person, Lu Chen did not scream or even lose his mind. He was like a cold and emotionless shadow as he slowly and cautiously squatted down beside the person and reached out to flip her over. When his hand touched that person's body, he suddenly felt a moist sensation on his hand. Immediately after, that person's body moved a little and suddenly raised his head. He looked at Lu Chen and called out, "Brother Lu." Lu Chen's body trembled. Looking at Xian's pale face, he suddenly felt his body relax, as if there was a heavy burden on his heart. He was even slightly absent-minded for a moment before bursting into laughter. Xian looked at him strangely and asked, "What are you laughing at?" Lu Chen's tears seemed to be coming out from his laughter. He waved his hand and said, "Nothing, nothing, I just want to laugh when I see you." Xian mumbled something. No one knew what she was saying. Lu Chen, on the other hand, let out a long sigh of relief. He felt that everything that had happened tonight was insignificant. He felt that the night was very beautiful. The moon was very round. Perhaps the world was not completely dark. He laughed to himself. Then when he looked down, he saw his palm. The hand that he used to push Xian's body. His smile suddenly froze on his face. Under the moonlight, his hand was blood red. His palms and fingers were dripping with fresh blood. "The ground is so cold," Xian complained. Then she wanted to sit up. But she had only raised her body halfway when she suddenly lost her support and fell backwards. Lu Chen caught her and let Xian lean into his arms. He glanced at Xian's body. Her clothes were intact and there seemed to be no wounds. Then he looked at his own body. The clothes on his chest that she was leaning on were soaked with blood in just a short while. His face suddenly paled. He looked even paler than Xian's face. There was almost no blood. He carefully held Xian and moved his body forward a little. Then he looked at her back. His gaze was stunned. His body began to tremble slightly. Then he was silent. He slowly stretched out his hands and once again embraced Xian in his arms. Xian leaned comfortably on Lu Chen's chest and let out a long sigh. Her voice sounded a little low, but there was still some of her initial naivety. She said, "What happened? You don't seem to have any strength left." Lu Chen gently hugged her. His lips moved slightly. Then he said softly, "It's okay. I just need to rest for a while." Xian said, "Oh." She looked very obedient. It seemed that she had returned to the time when she was with Lu Chen in the land of chaos. She was obedient to everything he said. Lu Chen looked at her. A deep and inexplicable pain flashed through his eyes. But his expression seemed to be calm. He said as if nothing had happened, "Why are you lying on the ground?" "I don't know." Xian pouted. She looked a little angry. But soon, it seemed that she didn't even have the strength to be angry. She sighed and said, "I promised Sister Su that I would help her take care of Sumo in the guest room." Sumo. Lu Chen closed his eyes and slowly said these two words. It was as if he was gritting his teeth and the sound came through the gaps between his teeth. "Yes, it's him," Xian said. "He took the medicine and has been sleeping." Then, well, it seemed to thunder, and he began to shout gibberish, but then he was all right again. "I'm still standing here. I think of you, Brother Lu. Oh, the moon is good today." "Hey, why is there a moon? Isn't it raining? Why did I faint?" "I don't know." Her voice became softer and softer. Her eyes began to close slowly. It seemed that she was very tired. Lu Chen looked at the girl in his arms. He seemed to have thousands of words in his heart, but he couldn't say a word. Xian's slender eyelashes moved. She opened her eyes again and said softly, "Why do I feel a little uncomfortable?" Lu Chen stood up silently. He carried Xian and walked forward, leaving this dark world. Then he said calmly, "It's nothing. You're a little injured." "Injured?" Xian seemed a little surprised. But she seemed to be too tired. She didn't think to see where she was injured. "Yes," Lu Chen repeated gently to her. Then he smiled and said, "It's just a small injury. It's nothing." "Oh, I don't want it." Xian suddenly cried softly. "Don't what?" Lu Chen asked her. At the same time, he had already walked out of the corridor and walked down the mountain. Xian frowned. She seemed to be afraid and disgusted. She pouted and said, "I don't want that kind of bug." You used to always put bugs on me. It's disgusting. Lu Chen's footsteps paused. He continued to walk forward. At the same time he said softly, "Okay, don't put that bug juice on me. Besides, I can't find that kind of thing now." Exian suddenly seemed happy. She smiled. But her whole body slowly leaned against his chest. She said softly, "Brother Lu, I'm a little cold." Lu Chen's hands tightened. He held her in his arms. At the same time, a drop of water fell on Exian's white face. Exian's eyes seemed to be a little blurry. But she still felt it. She shook her head and said, "Hey, it's raining. Or are you crying, Brother Lu?" "Nonsense. I've killed countless people. I have a heart of stone for more than 10 years. How could I cry?" Lu Chen said with a smile. He walked forward. Then, a drop of water fell from his cheek and fell on Exian's chest. Exian answered. She seemed to completely believe Lu Chen's words. But after a moment she asked again, "Brother Lu, can you cure my injury?" "I said it's a small matter. The medicine will cure it. Don't worry," Lu Chen said. "But I don't want to stay here," Exian said. "I'll take you away," Lu Chen said immediately. His tone was as firm as steel, as if this was the right thing to do, as if everything was only natural. "Where do you want to go?" Lu Chen asked. Exian's head was completely leaning on his chest. Her eyes were slightly closed. Her face was so pale that it seemed to be transparent. The breath in her mouth was also weak. But it seemed that she still didn't want to sleep. She still wanted to talk. So she persisted and woke up again. She forced her eyes open and smiled at Lu Chen. "I want to see my parents," Exian said. "Let's go now." Lu Chen held her and suddenly sped up. But after a moment, he suddenly felt something. He looked down and saw that Exian's eyes were open. She was staring at his face. "What's wrong?" Lu Chen suddenly didn't dare to look at this pair of pure and clear eyes. He looked away. Then he heard Exian whisper, "Brother Lu, you lied to me again." "I didn't," Exian suddenly interrupted him and said, "I saw it. You were crying so sadly." Under the moonlight, the man's face was covered in tears. He shook his head and gritted his teeth, trying to laugh. But each laugh turned into a hoarse whimper. He wanted to beat his chest and yell at her, but he didn't dare to look at her eyes again. Under the moonlight, he held the girl and staggered forward. He was like a stray dog that had lost its home. He crazily wanted to grasp the last bit of hope, but in the end, he couldn't stop the girl in that warmth from leaving. Her pale hand reached out and Exian wiped his face, wiping away some of the tears. Then she complained to herself, although her voice was very soft and low. "I haven't even gone to the heaven vault cloud realm. In the end, even the mountain has collapsed. How boring." Her voice gradually became lower and finally couldn't be heard. Lu Chen's footsteps instantly stopped. He watched as that hand slid down from his face and weakly slid to the girl's side. He was dumbfounded. He slowly raised his head and looked at the deep night sky, as well as the cold moon. The black fire once again burned fiercely in his eyes. A terrifying and ice-cold murderous intent leaped out from the darkness like the shadow of a demon, emitting a soundless howl towards the darkness. The night, the deeper it got, the colder it got. Chapter 240. Su Qingjun left the Zhangyang Hall on Heavenly Kuan Peak a little later than most people. She was passing by Chen Deng, Mingyue, and her master, Taoist Master Mu Yuan, when Taoist Master Mingzhu suddenly asked her to wait at the entrance. Masato Kahara was somewhat dissatisfied with this, but Su Qingjun was a filial disciple, so in order to avoid conflict between her master and them, she voluntarily stayed behind. Later, He came over, but Su Qingjun didn't like this person. Even though He was one of the most outstanding genius disciples of the younger generation of the Kunlun party, just like her. Sumo was her only younger brother, but he was seriously injured by He, so the hatred between them was already very deep. Moreover, Su Qingjun could more or less feel that although He usually didn't do anything out of line, including looking at her with a peaceful gaze most of the time, he also had a feeling of disgust towards the Su family. Su Qingjun didn't know how the Su family on her side had offended him, that he would always target the Su family. Perhaps it was because of He Gang's death a few days ago? In retrospect, He Gang's death was indeed a little strange. No matter who saw the timing of his death, they would suspect that the Su family secretly did it to vent their anger. But Su Qingjun herself knew that the Su family didn't do it. After leaving Zhangyang Hall, Su Qingjun was worried about Sumo, who was still unconscious in the Fragrance Garden's guest room, so she rushed all the way back. But halfway there, she heard a loud noise, just like countless Kunlun party disciples, and then witnessed the most shocking change in the Kunlun Mountains in 1,000 years. Strange peaks fell, the mountains collapsed, and a terrible and huge pillar of light soared into the sky. It was a scene of doomsday. The entire Kunlun Mountain was in an uproar. Everyone in the Kunlun party was in a state of panic. Countless people rushed out of their houses and rushed over there. Su Qingjun was also in the crowd. At that moment, she was also shocked. Then, when she saw a large number of people rushing over, she involuntarily followed them into the sky. For such an earth-shattering phenomenon, something unimaginable must have happened. It might even be related to the survival of the entire Kunlun sect. Because it was the winter peak where Hakushin Jinkuan's Immortal's Cave was located among the clouds in the sky. What the hell happened? She also wanted to know. After returning to Chenkuan Peak's Zhangyang Hall with the flow of people in that direction, Su Qingjun soon found that things seemed to be more complicated than she thought. The elders of the Kunlun party were indeed experienced and knowledgeable. They did not panic in the face of chaos. In a short while, several Yuanying Zhenren came out to calm the crowd. At the same time, they kept issuing orders, and soon, the situation was under control. The crowd slowly calmed down, but there were many people as smart and astute as Su Qingjun. They quickly noticed that something was not quite right. Such a big event had happened, but the head of the Kunlun party, Idle Month, did not come out to command the overall situation. Even though everyone knew that he should definitely be in Zhangyang Hall that night. The Yuanying Zhenren who came out to command and calm the crowd were mostly from the Baichao Tang branch. Su Qingjun even saw her own master, Masato Kahara, among them. When the bright moonlight suddenly appeared in the sky, she could clearly see her master's face brimming with excitement and a smile. Even his voice and movements when he was giving orders to others had unconsciously become confident and at ease. Su Qingjun had some guesses in her heart, but she was not too willing to believe in her intuition. Therefore, she had been standing in the crowd and did not go forward. After staying on Tiankuan Peak for a while, she found that those Yuanying Zhenren had no intention of arranging for people to go to the clouds in the sky. She then quietly left. The moonlight was very bright, but the night was equally dark. The Kunlun mountain range, which had just experienced an earth-shattering change, seemed to still be shrouded in darkness. Su Qingjun walked quickly towards the direction of the Fragrance Garden. As she walked and walked, there was no trace of other people on the road. Seeing that she was about to reach the mountain peak where the Fragrance Garden was located, Su Qingjun's footsteps suddenly stopped. She felt a slightly fishy wind blowing from the mountain path ahead. Immediately after, a human figure suddenly appeared. A man staggered down from the mountain path ahead. His expression was one of panic and fear, as if he had seen the thing he was most afraid of in his life. It was Sumo. Su Qingjun was shocked and quickly went up to greet him. She called out, "Sumo, what happened to you?" Sumo's body trembled. Her eyes that seemed to be in a state of confusion and blankness suddenly seemed to clear up a little. She stopped and looked towards Su Qingjun. After being stunned for a moment, she suddenly called out in a hoarse voice, "Sister?" Su Qingjun ran in front of her and looked at Sumo's disheveled appearance with astonishment. She said, "You're awake. Are you feeling better? Why did you suddenly run down the mountain by yourself?" Sumo stared blankly at her. After a while she said, "I'm fine. I want to go home now and tell father and mother this good news so they don't have to worry anymore." Su Qingjun hesitated for a moment, but in the end, she still nodded. The Kunlun party couldn't be considered too peaceful tonight, so going to her home in Kunwa City could be considered a safe place. She immediately said in a soft voice, "That's fine too. You can go. I have to first thank the elders for saving you. I'll also go back to see you later. Right, isn't Exian looking after you?" "She's now." Before she could finish speaking, she saw Sumo suddenly turn around and run away with large strides, looking as if he was very anxious. Su Qingjuan's words were stuck in her mouth for a moment. Soon after, she frowned and looked at Sumo with some surprise. There was a bit of doubt in her eyes, but perhaps it was because she saw him running as if he was flying and seemed to be really well, so she relaxed. After standing in place and thinking for a moment, she decided to continue up the mountain. In any case, Dongfeng Tao and Melaleuca Japonica, the two elders, had treated her younger brother, Sumo, so she had to thank them in person. Little sister Exian had helped her greatly, so she also had to go and thank them. In fact, it was reasonable to say that Sumo should also stay and thank them. However, since this good-for-nothing brat ran away by himself, she would have to complete these things herself. She sighed softly, shook her head, and walked up the mountain. The mountain path was undulating and curved, and the moonlight shone through the gaps between the branches of the forest, shining on her beautiful face. In the darkness of the night, there was a bit of coldness. After walking for an unknown amount of time, probably halfway up the mountain, Su Qingjun suddenly heard the sound of footsteps coming down from the mountain. The footsteps sounded especially heavy, and the sound paused, as if they were stepping on the bottom of her heart, drifting out in the darkness, trampling through the original silence of this place. Su Qingjun stopped in her tracks, a little surprised. As the footsteps approached, she saw the figure walking in front of her. Her eyes suddenly widened, and the surprise on her face instantly turned into inconceivable shock and fear. A person walked down the mountain path. To be exact, it was a person holding another person's body. With the help of the moonlight falling from the sky, Su Qingjun could clearly see that the man was Lu Chen, and the pale-faced woman he was tightly hugging, and the person who had one hand hanging limply by her side, was Exian. "You, Exian!" Su Qingjun exclaimed in surprise and ran over with quick steps. However, she just arrived before Exian when she smelled a strong smell of blood. Moreover, Exian's practically pale face and chest that had stopped rising and falling had already explained everything. Su Qingjun almost could not believe her own eyes. When she left this morning, Exian was clearly that lively young lady with a sweet smile. How did it become like this at night? What happened to her? Su Qingjuan's eyes were misty, her voice trembling as she looked up at Lu Chen and asked. Then, her body suddenly shook, a shocked expression on her face, and subconsciously took a step back. The Lu Chen in front of her seemed to be completely different from the man in her memory. The warmth and cheerfulness he once had, and that smile that seemed to be there forever, had all disappeared. Right now, Lu Chen's face was solemn, expressionless, looking like it was carved out of stone, cold and full of killing intent. Lu Chen's eyes were perhaps the only part of his face that still had some liveliness, but for some reason, Su Qingjun felt that she might be seeing things, because she seemed to see flames from that pair of eyes, and what's more, that fire was actually black. Just like this boundless, deep night. "She's dead." Lu Chen's voice sounded emotionless, so cold as if he was talking about something that had nothing to do with him. Su Qingjun shook her head in disbelief, did not even have the time to care about the strange look in Lu Chen's eyes. Her eyes once again fell on Exian's face, said in a low voice, Why is it like this? Aren't you helping me look after Sumo? When I saw him just now he was still fine. Why would you suddenly? You saw Sumo?" Lu Chen suddenly asked. That voice sounded a bit cold, like the cold wind in this night, blowing coldly. Su Qingjun looked at Exian, her mouth half open, her face sorrowful, as if she still could not immediately accept this reality, nodded subconsciously, said, "Yes, just now at the foot of the mountain." "Where did he go?" Su Qingjun said, "He said he wanted to go home first, so I let him go, said I wanted to come over to thank Exian and her master, and we'll go back later." Lu Chen suddenly stepped forward, and Su Qingjun was startled, hurriedly stopped him, said, "Where are you going? What is going on with Exian?" Lu Chen suddenly turned his head, coldly looked at her. In that pair of eyes, there seemed to be a ghost fire flickering, the dark flame suddenly flourished, an icy bone-piercing chill seemed to hit her in the face. Su Qingjuan's whole body turned cold, her heart greatly alarmed, retreating 2 steps back. At that moment, she actually felt so clearly, that terrifying killing intent directly enveloped her body. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.